the U.S. has to be engaged. I think the trip reaffirmed for all of us the importance of the United States taking a leadership role around the world. And if the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated anything, it is that some of the most pressing of today's challenges are global, and our response to those challenges must also be global. A key part of the U.S.'s engagement is the development assistance we provide around the globe through USAID. The words "from the American people" send a message to the world about the generosity of this country. That is why on our trip, I wore my cap that said USAID, from the American people to the rest of the world. However, they also reflect our understanding that what happens beyond our borders can affect us also here at home. Pandemics like COVID-19 are only the most recent example of that. The President's fiscal year 22 budget request includes $58.5 billion for state and USAID to address these global challenges. And as you may have noticed, Administrator Power, you have a lot of work to do. You are faced with the most significant global public health disaster in generations, humanitarian emergencies in Ethiopia, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen, just to name a few, and a rising authoritarian challenge to the world's democracies, a deepening climate crisis that threatens to undo decades of U.S. investment abroad, and much, much more. The United States has a significant role to play in all of these issues, and those missions will require a strong USAID. Ultimately, a strong USAID begins with a strong workforce, which I was pleased to see has a proposed 11% increase in this budget request. USAID staff serve in the most challenging posts, executing USAID's mission to advance a free, peaceful, and prosperous world. To do this effectively, USAID's workforce should also look like the America it represents, reflective of the diversity of our great nation and benefiting from the value that diverse perspectives offer. USAID contractors should also reflect this diversity. And I recently sent you a letter requesting the names and scale of businesses of the top contractors for USAID. My intention is to have this committee conduct and publish its own research on the diversity of USAID contractors, including diversity of senior management, boards, and shareholders where applicable. A significant priority of our global engagement has to be around vaccines, which are among the top priorities in many countries right now. The President's commitment to donate more than 500 million doses of vaccine over the next year is very, very important. But we cannot stop there, as it is a drop in the bucket compared to what the world needs. I hope to hear more about how we can strengthen countries' capacity and resilience to address all future health challenges, from COVID to malaria to maternal and child health. And while we continue to work hard to address the COVID-19 pandemic, we cannot lose focus on the other existential crises threatening our planet: climate change. USAID again has a critical role to play by supporting countries to transition away from fossil fuels and mitigate the effects of a changing climate. I was pleased to see a significant proposed increase in both the focus and funding to tackle the challenges climate change poses around the world. And so I'm glad that we finally have the opportunity today to have you, Administrator Power, appear before our committee. And I was pleased when President Biden announced that you would be his nominee to lead the USAID. You, as an immigrant to this country, who have dedicated her life to securing human rights for those who've been denied them, you uniquely understand what our country stands for. And you understand how our values should be transformed into action around the world. I thank you and appreciate you being here. And I now recognize Mr. McCall for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. And I also want to thank Administrator Power for joining us today. Let me say I really enjoyed our phone call. last month. I thought it was very productive. You're very well qualified, and I look forward to working with you along with the chairman. As we look at the many global challenges, including COVID-19 recovery, the work of USAID and our partners has never been more important. I'm gravely concerned about the growing humanitarian emergency and refugee crisis that is brewing in Afghanistan right now. Hard-fought gains to advance stability, women's rights, and democracy are being wiped out as the Taliban continues to retake that country. The president has reiterated U.S. assistance to Afghanistan will continue post-withdrawal, but I would find that more difficult as the Taliban takes over. As the security situation worsens, I'm concerned about your ability to monitor and implement these critical assistance programs. Turning to Africa, as the chairman said, there are many spots around the world and many crises, but in Africa, the man-made famine in the Tigray region of Ethiopia threatens the lives of millions. And the government of Ethiopia continues to restrict humanitarian aid access and the people of Tigray who are starving. I'm also concerned by rising instability and terrorist activity in northern Mozambique and in the Sahel and in coastal West Africa. In 2019, Congress passed my Global Fragility Act. The law requires the administration to coordinate diplomatic, development, and defense efforts. This will help stabilize conflict areas and address the root causes of fragility. Yet the selection of priority countries by this administration is over 6 months late, and I hope Administrator you and I can work together with the listing of those countries. Turning to the Western Hemisphere, the crisis at our southern border is the worst that I've seen throughout my professional career. USAID plays a critical role in supporting economic growth and in combating violence and corruption to address root causes of migration. In fact, Administrator Power, I talked to your predecessor, Mark Green, just this last weekend about efforts that can be taken in the Northern Triangle, Central American countries to help further private investment, which I think would greatly get to the root cause of the migration. In Cuba, we have historic protests that demonstrate the people's rejection of the communist dictatorship there. I believe this administration must support their democratic aspirations and hold regime officials accountable for human rights violations. And then in Haiti, recent unrest and threatening the assassination is threatening an already fragile political and economic situation. Also concerned by the humanitarian crisis and suffering in Syria, Yemen, and Venezuela with no end in sight. And around the world, USAID plays a critical role in countering the malign investments of the Chinese Communist Party, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And on the top of these global challenges, the COVID-19 pandemic has erased years of progress towards ending extreme poverty. It has pushed millions more people into severe food insecurity, malnutrition, and has destabilized fragile states. That's why I believe that the United States needs to get our vaccines out of the door into these nations. Our allies and partners are left in limbo, unsure what to expect from both U.S. assistance and COVAX allocations. It is disturbing that COVAX has announced that it will purchase and distribute less effective Chinese manufactured COVID-19 vaccines. In fact, we had an amendment on our markup yesterday on this from Ann Wagner. But especially as the CCP continues to use vaccines to further their own coercive political and economic agenda, it is my assessment that we are not winning in this vaccine diplomacy. And I believe the administration needs to correct that. In the last year, Congress appropriated over $16 billion to support global COVID-19 response efforts. This was critical funding to combat the pandemic overseas, as well as address second-order impacts. And then this year, the administration requested an increase of $7 billion. And while I understand there are rising global needs, I am concerned the agency will not be able to effectively do this program and the money, particularly on top of the unspent COVID funds. According to the latest OIG audit, USAID missions are unable to fully monitor foreign aid programs due to COVID-19 limitations. The U.S. has long been the largest foreign donor, but we can't do this alone. And as the U.S. does more, our partners need to step up as well. So I urge the administration to maintain the journey to self-reliance framework championed by former Administrator Mark Green. Ending the need for foreign aid should be the goal of all of our development programs. And ultimately, the U.S. model for foreign aid and the goal of advancing country self-reliance stands in stark contrast with the malign efforts of the Chinese Communist Party. The so-called aid provided by the CCP through its Belt and Road Initiative pushes countries into crippling debt traps while bolstering authoritative regimes. Our foreign aid must serve as a clear alternative while saving lives and projecting U.S. global leadership around the world. So, Administrator, you obviously have a lot of work to do, but as always, the Chairman and I are very much looking forward to working with you on these many challenges. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to turn to the chair and the ranking member of the International Development International Organization of Global Corporate Social Impact Subcommittee. So I yield 1 minute to Chairman Castro.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks. Good afternoon, and thank you, Administrator Power, for your leadership and for stepping up to meet this challenging moment. Humanitarian assistance and international development is part of the foundation, as you know, of America's infrastructure for diplomacy. When people in crisis see the words U.S. aid, they know that help and also hope has arrived. That's what's happening right now with 80 million COVID vaccines being delivered to people in desperate need of relief around the world. This pandemic has not only exposed how interconnected and intertwined we all are, but also exacerbated humanity's greatest challenges: poverty, safety, migration, injustice. The American people and their representatives in Congress support USAID's work because helping our friends and neighbors is in our DNA, and also because it advances the United States' own prosperity and ultimately our own security. I look forward to working together and discussing a wide range of issues today. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair Castro. I now yield 1 minute to the subcommittee ranking member, Maliotakis. You're now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman. Administrator Power, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I look forward to having a productive discussion with you in the committee this morning. Ms. Power, the work USAID is doing on the ground each day is important, and I'd like to take this opportunity to use my minute to ask for your assistance. In 1959, my mother fled Cuba as a refugee for the United States, leaving behind her family who still live there today. My cousins and millions of other Cubans have suffered for over 60 years under a brutal communist regime which has cruelly denied them basic freedoms, human rights, and have left them starving, unable to access food and other necessities like medicine, toilet paper, and soap. As you know, in recent days, the Cuban people have taken to the streets in historic numbers, rejecting the communist regime in complete desperation. In response, the regime has resorted to beating, abducting, and even shooting these dissidents. The Cuban people are starving, living only off of $15 per month, while the regime lives like kings. But even if they had the resources, the store shelves are completely empty. Now, for years, U.S. aid has attempted pro-democracy efforts in Cuba, and we appreciate that. And as we live through this critical moment in the history of the Cuban people, I'm pleading with you and all my colleagues that are on this committee to urge the State Department to push the regime to allow the non-government organizations that you partner with to go to Cuba to provide the basic necessities the Cuban people need to survive. This was a request that was also made with Venezuela, and it has occurred. And I really look forward to our conversation today and working together to ensure that American dollars support programs that reflect our interests abroad. And thank you for your service. I yield back.
Young lady's time has expired. So I will now introduce our distinguished witness, Administrator Samantha Power. Administrator Power was sworn in as the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development on May 3rd, 2021. Administrator Power had last served in government during the Obama administration, where she served on the National Security Council staff and later as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. And while at the UN, she worked to rally countries to combat the Ebola epidemic, ratify the Paris Climate Agreement, and develop new legal frameworks to cripple ISIS financial networks. Administrator Power has spent much of her career outside of government, working on human rights issues, and began her career as a journalist, reporting from places including Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. She's also a very accomplished author, having won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. So I'm delighted to present Administrator Power. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Meeks, Ranking Member McCall, esteemed members of the committee. Each of the topics you've raised warrants a hearing unto itself. I'm not volunteering to come back for every one of those hearings just yet, but I really hope we can delve into the substance on Cuba, on Afghanistan, on Tigray, and of course on COVID and vaccine diplomacy. I traveled last month to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador to hear directly from the people impacted by the cycles of poverty, violence, the climate shocks, the corruption. I wanted to assess the impact U.S. assistance was having on their lives. And what I saw there was a kind of microcosm of what has been described, I think, in the 4 opening statements. It was just a local reflection of global trends, the universe in a grain of sand. People continuing to lose loved ones and to suffer through lockdowns due to a still raging COVID-19 pandemic that has already left 4 million people dead around the world. Families that have been traumatized by more frequent and intense hurricanes and what have been rare weather events, many in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, and citizens who are angered by poor governance, autocratic behavior, and corruption that limits opportunity, investment, prosperity, and personal freedom. These challenges are kind of coming together in very volatile ways. And we've seen that culminating in frustration all around the world, whether it's just this week in Cuba, people being driven to the streets by the human rights abuses, by the economic mismanagement and wreckage, whether it's rage that spills over into deadly conflict like we have seen in Burma and in Tigray, the Tigray region of Ethiopia, or whether it's despair that causes people to flee their communities, as we've seen in Central America and around the world, as we're now facing a level of mass displacement that we have not seen since World War II, which is really saying something. Suffice it to say, these are not positive developments, but as an American and a relative newcomer to USAID, I have to say I'm really glad that there is an American development agency called USAID that is uniquely positioned to confront this range of challenges. And I'm also incredibly grateful to you as a citizen and now, of course, as administrator for sustaining support for the agency's vital programming, bipartisan support. And I think it's reflected in the comments that we've heard. There are differences here or there, but by and large, an understanding of the importance of American leadership, the extent to which our fates are connected to those of people living elsewhere, and a recognition that USAID is saving and improving millions of lives each day while enhancing US national and economic security. As we emerge from a once-in-a-century pandemic, and as we seek to confront, and I hope we can talk about this, the inroads that China has made in different parts of the world by using its financial power as leverage to advance its interests in a very transactional and predatory way, we have come to you with a FY22 budget request of $27.7 billion for foreign assistance funding, fully or partially implemented by USAID. And that is to help us address urgent priorities of the kind that we've already touched upon, and to allow the United States to lead the world in providing development and humanitarian assistance to promote security and improved economic conditions. These resources would also allow the United States to lead on the global stage, to leverage our activities, to get our allies to do more, and to bring more private sector partners to the table. In order for us to get the most out of USAID programs, we also know we must make ourselves more capable and more nimble at a time of this heightened need. And one way we will do that is we will seek to increase local partnerships. And I'll just say a word about that quickly. And we will seek to address what are pretty substantial staffing shortfalls. Lasting solutions to development challenges, sustainable development, require local organizations and local partners that have insights into their own circumstances to develop tailored solutions. They also have the credibility in their communities to help implement them. However, in FY2020, and this predated the last administration and the one before it, USAID obligated approximately 5.6% of its resources to local partners around the world, 5.6%, to engage authentically, again, with those partners in the spirit of self-reliance and to move toward a more locally led development approach is staff, time, and resource intensive, and maybe we can get into it in the discussion, but it is really vital to our long-term success for us ultimately to work ourselves out of business. I look forward to engaging you in the near future about how we can pursue flexible solutions to allow us to increase our level of local partnership at the same time we protect taxpayer dollars. The budget that we propose will also help us build institutional capacity commensurate with USAID's role as a national security agency. Over the last 2 decades, the funding levels and complexity of USAID programs has expanded at a rate that significantly outpaces our direct hire staffing. Each USAID contracting officer, for instance, has managed more than $65 million annually. It's a lot of money over the last 4 years. That is more than 4 times the amount managed by their counterparts at the Department of Defense, who manage an average of about $15 million in contracts annually. Moving forward, we are seeking not a return to the previous status quo, but to work with you to increase our number of direct hires while maintaining a strong focus, as the chairman indicated, on creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive agency. With your support, USAID will move aggressively to tackle the world's toughest challenges in order to build a more stable and prosperous future for us all. And I look forward to our continued bipartisan partnership and to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Administrator Powell. We thank you for that excellent testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witness. I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. Now, if you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we'll come back to you. So I'll start off by recognizing myself. We also know that we have so many members on that I'm going to be somewhat strict with enforcing the 5-minute time limit for questioning. So please don't take up your question for 4 minutes and 59 seconds and then expect the administrator to be able to answer the question. So be mindful of that so that we can get everyone to ask the chance to ask the question. So the 5-minute rule will be in process. I now recognize myself for the 5 minutes. I clock myself. So, Ambassador, and I'm tempted to always call you Ambassador. I know you're now Administrator, but after last week's assassination of President Moise, the prospects, I think, for free and fair election taking place in Haiti this year looks even less likely. And the Biden administration has voiced its support for elections to take place as soon as possible. And while I would like to see nothing more than for that to happen, I am still very concerned that rushing to elections for election's sake can have dire consequences. So given the current instability and violent conditions coupled with what continues to be a dysfunctional process, do you believe free and fair elections in Haiti are remotely feasible this year? And if so, what's being put into place so that the elections are representative of the needs of the Haitian people?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your longstanding work with the Haitian people over such a long period of time. it's a devastating turn against a backdrop of really difficult economic and security conditions that predated the horrific assassination of the president. I think you put your finger, and I'm just going to go right to your question, on the tension here. You have, on the one hand, significant practical questions about having, whether conditions can be put in place for free and fair elections given COVID, given the security downturn. At the same time, you have three claimants right now to leadership of the country and a disputed set of accounts as to how the successor to the president should be chosen. And so I think that is the tension that we are seeking to balance. In terms of whether these elections can occur in the time frame that I think is in the interest of the country overall, right, is to have a legitimate leader chosen by the people. I think we're doing that assessment. USAID is a part of that, along with our election assistance partners. But for there to be a limbo and a leadership void carries with it some, significant downside risks as well. And I just give you one example just to concretize this. As you know, the Haitian, even to call it the Haitian authorities, some of them at least have requested security augmentation. And there's some question about whether they want it from the United Nations or from the OAS or bilateral assistance. The question of who the sovereign is with the authority to make a request of that nature, for example, at the United Nations, is one that, again, three individuals have with significant influence have a say over. So I think the hope is to get them done by February 2022. But in the meantime, to have those individuals and others unite around the cause of stability and put in place recognized provisional authorities in advance of the people speaking.
Thank you for that. Let me quickly on this diversity issue, which is very significant important to me. There was a 2018 GAO report and one of the most striking findings in that was that USAID's civil service, racial or ethnic minorities were 31 to 41% less likely to be promoted than whites with similar jobs or years of service. So can you tell us what specifically you're doing to address disparities in promotions among staff, or the risk that diverse candidates are eliminated early in the hiring process and so never have a chance to be considered as finalists?
Thank you. There are a number of dimensions to this, and we've had the chance to discuss this privately a little bit. First is recruitment. You have to broaden the pool of actors who even know that USAID is an opportunity for them. That means not just going to and developing partnerships with minority-serving institutions, as we have done in recent years, I'm pleased to say, but actually trying to reach people earlier. So not just at Alcorn State, but actually, having USAID veterans speak at high schools and seek out, again, diverse student bodies so that this gets planted as a gleam in the eye of a young person. But the GAO study that you pointed to speaks to a different issue, which is, are the conditions within USAID suitable to ensure retention and fair treatment and equity? And clearly that study, which I believe relates to civil service, indicates in some measure that the conditions are not what they should be. One of the first things I did when I was confirmed to become USAID administrator is to sign a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, but it's pretty high level and we need to flesh it out, do the barrier analysis, figure out what is it about the way we are promoting that would produce that kind of disparate outcome, because it's certainly, on the basis of what I've seen, is not at all correlated with the quality of contributions that people are making. I'm going to hire, with the support of Congress, the first ever full-time coordinator in the front office for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's a person and a full-time team working on these issues day to day. Gravity alone is not going to do it, nor is a strategic plan without accountability to a set of benchmarks that we need to set.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now recognize Ranking Member McCall for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Administrator Power. It's great to see you again. And I'd like to just quickly talk about Afghanistan. As you know, the security conditions are deteriorating very rapidly, with the Taliban taking probably more than 80% of the country. surrounding the provincial capitals and the embassy in Kabul. What is your, and I know it's subject to security on the ground, but what is USAID's plan to get assistance to what we know is going to be a major humanitarian crisis?
Thank you. Well, our international partners certainly are doing contingency planning for refugee outflows into neighboring countries. The estimates now are 500,000 by the end of the year, likely to flow outward. It is that and that is a large number, but even some of the darker scenarios would produce an even more substantial outflow than that, as you all know. There's internal displacement, which we already see. I think what I would just say is that one can't, you know this better than I do, but it's important not to decouple the security conversation and what our security partnership with the Afghan National Forces looks like from the question of embassy security and our development programming. Our partners right now, notwithstanding the fall of multiple district centers, want to stay. Many of our partners were there before 9/11 and before the US arrived. I mean, they've been in Afghanistan for 50, 60 years, some of them. The other dimension of how we seek to be nimble in this very difficult circumstance is that because of COVID, many of our implementing partners have been working also remotely to reach beneficiaries, sort of not going to offices, not coming to the embassy, et cetera. So I think right now the will is there, even in territories that the Taliban has taken over. You see UN agencies like the World Food Program able to operate for now. But the other piece of this, and you and I had the chance to talk about this on the phone, and I really appreciate your outspoken leadership on this, is being able to offer assurances to our USAID employees, to our implementing partners, that we have their backs. And that just as they seek to stay, that if we do end up in the darkest of all scenarios, that we will stand with them. And that's what all the planning around SIVs and potentially a refugee resettlement program also entails.
And if I could, and thank you. And if I could say, I commend the administration for paying attention to the interpreter issue, announcing today that they will be evacuated to a safe country. Just with a little bit of time I have left, COVAX. I just, this has to be strategic to counter the CCP's vaccine diplomacy efforts. I'm seeing it taking place in many countries where they want exchanges for promises about Taiwan, or they want to have access to military bases, et cetera. Where are we with that program? And also, just if I could add, this Texas Children's Hospital, Baylor College of Medicine have come out with a phase 3 vaccine that one shot doesn't need the refrigeration like the others, and it's not subjected to the Defense Production Act. They've already signed a contract for 300 million doses with India, and I see this as an opportunity to collaborate with them, in addition to Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J, to try to get this vaccine out where it's most needed.
Thank you. There's a lot both in what you just said and then in your opening statement as well about the Chinese purchase that I hope I'll have a chance to get to. But just in brief, it is extremely important that the United States is now in the vaccine shipping business. We did have acute domestic needs. We've made a lot of progress across the country, still much more to be done. But donating that 80 million doses, seeing the gratitude in the spirit of partnership, as you say, not in a predatory way, not in okay, you scratch our back, then here's what we're going to ask you to do tomorrow, but in that spirit that I think needs to undergird all of our programming. That's really important. The 500 million dose purchase that the United States negotiated to bring the prices way down, those 500 million are going to go through COVAX to low-income and lower middle-income countries. The problem right now, and maybe your Texas idea, I'm not Anthony Fauci and CDC and wouldn't pretend to be, but I can tell you right now that the gating issue for every country, never mind for COVAX, is supply. And so the reason that COVAX found itself in this position of negotiating, a purchase, and by the way, it is appalling that China did not donate these vaccines. There are efficacy questions, and again, I'll leave that to the scientists, It does have a WHO license to be used, the Chinese vaccines, but having never contributed financially to COVAX, to not see fit to do what the G7 is doing, which is to donate that vaccines, is just completely outrageous and very typical, again, I think, of the Chinese development approach. But COVAX is in the position it's in because India's had to pull back so much supply that had been intended to go for second shots and for health workers. COVAX has found itself in this third quarter in a really difficult pinch. That's going to change when the Pfizer doses start coming online in August. It's already changing for some countries because of our bilateral dose sharing of surplus vaccines. But the more doses we can bring online, that can be part of the American leadership on this issue, where we single-handedly are not going to vaccinate the world, but we can mobilize the world to get it vaccinated. And I think that's a position we've moved into, but more needs to be done.
Well, thanks, Ambassador. Look forward to working with you, and my time's expired.
Correct, gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Brad Sherman of California for 5 minutes.
Ambassador, welcome back. I know you've focused on the terrible situation in Tigray, where the people face ethnic cleansing and famine, perhaps genocide. I sent a letter to your Assistant Administrator, Charles, and to the State Department, focusing on two things. One is in the State Department area, and I sent this letter July 7th, to pressure Eritrea and Ethiopia to allow humanitarian corridors to let us get food and medicine in. But until that can be achieved, do you have plans to fly food and medical aid into the two operating airports that are within Tigray?
Thank you, Congressman Sherman, and thank you especially for being in the weeds of this, because it is a dire situation if there ever was one. The combination of systematic sexual violence, mass atrocities, and the denial of food as a weapon of war. That's what we're talking about here. So to your question, every option is on the table, because our estimates are that 900,000 people in Tigray are at risk of famine. And that is not something we say lightly or our international partners say lightly. You know, the F word is a big deal. And with the Ethiopian government's withdrawal, notionally at least, of its forces from Ethiopia, its declaration, as it put it, of a unilateral ceasefire, but basically with the Tigrayans taking back over security for the province, what you've seen since that announcement roughly 2 weeks ago is bridges being destroyed, convoys being delayed, telecommunications equipment being confiscated. You know all this. So the short answer is the challenge, sir, is the same Ethiopian government that is denying road access. We need to get them to grant both road access, where you get way more food in, and air access. Then the question of airdrops arises, which is something we absolutely may have to be in a position to consider.
I know that you could fly over Sudan and into Tigray, and there are two
The scale.
I am so confident.
Yeah.
I'm very confident that you're going to do all that can be done, and that you're exploring all the avenues. And a couple of things to kind of respond for the record. Sri Lanka's civil war ravished the north and the east part of that country, and I hope that we are directing our aid to those areas. In Sindh, in southern Pakistan, I hope that you're making sure that that region gets its fair share of U.S. aid, particularly because they're dealing with the forced disappearances, the forced conversions of Hindu and Christian girls, etc. As to the Caucasus, Secretary Blinken promised to work with us to help the 100,000 ethnic Armenians who have been driven from their homes by Azeri aggression. But so far, the U.S. has provided only 5 million or even less in help to these Armenians. Are you planning to do more?
We have been focused on the displaced. I would like to follow up with you and maybe to hear more about what you have in mind, but that's an issue very close to my heart.
Thank you. And then shifting to the Middle East, I look forward to you implementing the Nita Lowy Middle East Partnership for Peace program. We've provided $50 million and expect to do that each year. I I'm confident that you'll enforce the Palestinian, that you'll enforce the Taylor Force Act. And I commend you for your cooperation with Israel's Agency for International Development, particularly in Africa. My question relates to Gaza, where Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched roughly 5,000 rockets at Israel. This was basically unprovoked in that Israel had taken no action with regard to Gaza, and there was a rent dispute involving a dozen families hundreds of miles away. Every previous effort to provide aid to Gaza, we've seen Hamas diversion of that aid and use of it for terrorist purposes. Does the administration have a plan to make sure that this doesn't happen again, or that at least we minimize it? And can you describe what is your plan?
Let me just say that the witness may have to respond in writing with only 5 seconds left. So if the witness will respond to that question in writing, I appreciate it because the gentleman's time is expired. I now go to Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ambassador Power, for your work over the years on combating genocide, which I understand was born out of a heartfelt revulsion of what happened in Rwanda and elsewhere, and in your role in standing up the Atrocities Prevention Board. I also know you played a key role in Secretary John Kerry's March 17th, 2016 declaration that ISIS was committing genocide against the Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims in Iraq and Syria. As I think you know, I'm the author of the Iraq and Syria Genocide Accountability Act, an important humanitarian law that authorized the administrator of USAID, you, and the Secretary of State to direct humanitarian stabilization and recovery assistance to these communities that had been bypassed to enable them to survive Iraq and in Syria. I traveled to Erbil, where the Catholic Church is doing incredible work to help Christians and Yazidi refugees. To date, USAID has given approximately $750,000 in grants to the Catholic University and about 2 million capacity building grants to the Ankawa Humanitarian Foundation. Both efforts have been very successful and they have empowered local people. So a couple of questions. Will you support continuing that program so that Iraqi victims of genocide, including Christians and Yazidis, can rebuild their lives and gain self-sufficiency? You also, and you and I both spoke this morning at the International Religious Freedom Summit, and you were very moving and spoke movingly about the Yazidi victims of the genocide of ISIS. But I didn't hear you reference the other groups, however, such as the Assyrian and Chaldean Christians. Given how important your support was in the 2016 declaration by Secretary Kerry, can you affirm that you still support Kerry's designation of ISIS as having committed genocide against Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims? Also, next week, the House will vote on a bill that I introduced along with Chairwoman Karen Bass to combat the African desert locust, which is compounding food crises in the Horn of Africa and in the Arabian Peninsula that are already made dire due to COVID, as you pointed out in your written testimony, and in conflict areas such as Tigray in Ethiopia, which you called staggering in your testimony, and in Yemen. The July 6th FAO statement said there's an upsurge, their word, of locusts remaining in the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and more efforts need to be done. Maybe you could speak to that issue. And finally, on neglected tropical diseases, which you referenced in your testimony, I did a bill that passed but did not pass the Senate, so we attached it to the appropriations bill as a number of items to it. And maybe you might want to speak to what, both in the written or in oral form, what is being done to really combat these NTDs. 1.4 million people have them. Many of these kids are walking around with worms. It's horrible and it's debilitating and sometimes deadly. Madam Ambassador.
Well, Congressman, thank you for your human rights leadership across the board, particularly on religious freedom, but also just the compassion you bring to so many of these communities that, otherwise may not get the kind of attention that you've been able to bring over the years. So I'm super grateful. I'll try to run through just quickly on the designation. Absolutely stand by it. As you know, if you attempted to give an exhaustive speech on religious freedom and religious protection issues in, what are we now, July 2021, we'd both still be speaking, at the venue. So please don't read anything into that. I'm very proud of the work that USAID has done. I'm sort of riding on the backs of what my predecessors have done and the appropriations that you all have made possible. And I think we want to look at it. I really view USAID's role in a policy space as well as in a programmatic space. So just like that genocide designation wasn't about giving anybody any money, it was a really important legal and policy statement, and helped me when I was at the UN also help mobilize a coalition against ISIS. So I think from the aid side, restoration of essential services to these communities, as some of them still either want to stay where they are or even return home, which is a remarkable tribute to their resilience and bravery. Rehabilitating critical infrastructure, access to jobs, basic dignity, and without that kind of programming in the economic space, you can condemn all you want, but there aren't going to be the livelihoods that will support the return, or again, the remaining that so many of them need to do. At the same time, engaging the Iraqi authorities at the local, the regional, and the national level, depending on where the critical levers are, but to make sure that there are actual protections, because these threats have not, in many of these communities, abated. On the locus, which is something I've just been getting educated on, it really is almost like a metaphor as well as an actual problem. Hell is empty and all the devils are here, as Shakespeare said once. It is, incredibly, this work that again, you and Representative Bass and others have put on the map. I gather we have treated more than 5 million acres of infested land since 2020, preventing the loss of 4 million metric tons of crops. And this is a classic stitch in time saves 9. That's $1.2 billion in crop yields, worth of crop yields that were saved by virtue of this effort. I gather things got better and now are turning downward again. So that is something that has my attention, whether it's providing surveillance aircraft training, pesticides and training about how to use the pesticides to avoid environmental damage and so forth. It's a very important enabling complement to the other work we do on food security.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Albio Sierras of New Jersey, who's the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Civilian Security, Migration, and International Economic Policy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Ambassador Powell, for your testimony today. As you know, in recent days, tens of thousands of Cubans in over 50 cities have protested against the dictatorship in Cuba, asking for freedom and democracy. I welcome President Biden's statement of support for the Cuban people, and I am glad to see that his budget request maintain a consistent level of funding for Cuban democracy and human rights programming, as I believe these programs are now more important than ever. Ambassador Powell, how can our programming help Cubans to exercise their fundamental rights and communicate freely, particularly given the internet restriction the regime has imposed during the protest?
Thank you so much. Well, first, just let me say how horrific, and to echo the comments, your comments and those of Congresswoman Maliotakis at the outset, just the crackdown, the repression. I think there's still 150 or so people, at least as of earlier today, who hadn't, whose families didn't know their whereabouts in terms of roundups and so forth. And this is just really a testament to the decades of economic mismanagement, but also people just being fed up with the denial of freedom. Our programming, as you know, it's about a $20 million appropriation, as I understand it, between state and USAID in terms of our Cuba programming. Ours has tended to emphasize training for civil society leaders, humanitarian support for political prisoners and the families of political prisoners, so those who've stuck their neck out over long periods of time, In terms of what this moment demands, I think it's very much, it's unfolding before our eyes. Again, just this people voting with their feet, risking their lives to stand up for the rights that they've been denied for so long. And so, any ideas you have about how we should think about tailoring programming, given these needs, with regard to the internet, I mean, the regime is afraid of the internet. It profits from the internet because it takes a cut of anytime anybody uses the internet. It's a source of income since it's so badly bungled the economy. But this is one of the ways that people have been communicating, connecting, and organizing these protests, which are unprecedented since the fall of the Soviet Union. So I don't have a specific answer in terms of how to pivot. Feels like things are very much fluid at the moment. But welcome consultation about how to. I mean, this is fundamentally the Cuban people, and wanting to follow their lead and be sensitive to their aspirations. This is their story.
Thank you. And I see that the president increased by $20 million help for Venezuela for economic support funds. I'm just wondering, who's going to receive that money? Is it the government or the people that really need it to develop? Because, there's a history there in Venezuela where any humanitarian aid or any help, Maduro takes it.
Yeah.
And I think our effort should be directed at the people.
Absolutely. No, we are very, very careful. Unfortunately, because so many people have fled Venezuela, as you well know, a lot of our humanitarian emergency assistance, not the ESF money you were talking about, it just goes to people, the Venezuelans living outside the country. I think we're up to $1.7 billion in assistance of that nature. But, we have found a way in circumstances like that in Venezuela and in Cuba to work with independent partners, those who are holding government accountable, independent media, civil society organization, again, not fake civil society, of the kind that certain regimes seek to domesticate, but the kind that are actually standing up, I think, for, again, these broader aspirations. Happy to go in offline into greater detail about who those partners are.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. So now recognize Representative Steve Chabot of Ohio, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. As the chair mentioned, I'm the ranking member on Asia and Pacific, and chaired that back during the Obama administration. And since the beginning of the Obama administration, even with the so-called pivot to Asia at that time, the amount of aid to this important region hasn't really grown that much over time. For example, it's a fraction of what we're giving to sub-Saharan Africa. It's about the same as what we're giving to the richest continent, Europe. And this is despite the fact that the Indo-Pacific has about half of the world's population. And it's arguably the most critical region when it comes to U.S. national interests. And it includes our #1 strategic competitor, China. Could you explain why the administration's foreign aid request doesn't more closely reflect our national interests across the globe?
Thank you. I guess I'd offer a couple thoughts. I mean, this is, as you said, this weighting, for example, toward programs in the Western Hemisphere or Sub-Saharan Africa. Just to talk about those regions for a second, and then I'll come back to Asia. Not to replicate in my response exactly what you're concerned about, but in Africa, so much of what we're doing is humanitarian emergency assistance. With acute food needs that dwarf any of those that we're seeing elsewhere in the world. In the Western Hemisphere, we have issues like Venezuela, Cuba, and then of course the Northern Triangle, which I'm sure we'll talk about in greater detail, where there is a connection, a very direct connection in the case of Northern Triangle to our southern border and to migration patterns and so forth. I think your point is extremely well taken. I think what we have tried to do as USAID is mobilize private sector capital. I'm also the vice chair of the Development Finance Corporation. You do have more middle-income countries and lower middle-income countries in Asia than you would in sub-Saharan Africa, where, again, extreme poverty is one of the driving issues animating our development assistance, given the link between extreme poverty and susceptibility also to radicalization. So I think that's part of the answer is just different economic circumstances. I will say that I testified earlier before the SFRC, and Senator Markey gave me an additional point in your favor, which was describing the number of extreme weather events in Asia as a proportion of the overall number, drastically higher than in other parts of the world. So, I can look into this. I do think if you looked at private sector and what we catalyzed as well as what we provide, you probably see more parity there. But I take your point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate if you at least keep that in mind. And I've got the chair is being pretty strict with our time today, so I wanted to get into one other area before I run out of time. I find it, and I know some of my colleagues do, pretty disturbing to see the administration's decision to restore aid to the Palestinians without apparently getting much, if anything, in return for that. And unfortunately, I think this has kind of become a pattern of giving away things and not necessarily getting much back. So I have just a couple of quick yes or no answers, if you could. Has the Palestinian Authority, for example, stopped advocating violence toward Israel? Is that something I missed? I assume the answer is no to that question.
Well, I mean, it would depend on, I'm sure there are individuals in the Palestinian Authority. I don't think Mr. Abbas is advocating violence in a public way.
All right. Well, let me ask you another one. Has the Palestinian Authority ended its support for the anti-Semitic BDS movement, for example?
No, it has not.
And has the PA, have they ended their pay to slay program?
I know you've asked for yes, no, but we are not advocating support for the Palestinian Authority. We are advocating support, for example, for girls' education, for sanitation, for cross-line programs between Israel.
I got 30 seconds. Has UNRWA done away with textbooks that call for the destruction of Israel, or do those still exist? So I think I'm making the points here. There's a lot of us concerned about that the Palestinians are getting a lot of money for not much, if any, improvement. And I would just ask the administration to keep a much closer eye on American tax dollars when it comes to giving them to organizations which are against both Israel and the United States. And I yield back my time.
If I could just say for 30 seconds, we follow the law, and the law is not to provide assistance to the Palestinian Authority or, of course, anything that would benefit Hamas. And to suggest that we are not following the law, that we are not vetting, and to draw a conflation between our beneficiaries and those who we would never fund in the case of Hamas and who we are not funding in the case of the Palestinian Authority because of the Taylor Force Act, I think is really not the right conflation to draw.
And I didn't mention Hamas. I'm talking about.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia, the President of the NATO Parliamentarian Assembly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador Power, welcome back. We're so glad you're in your position. Look forward to working with you over the next 4 years. I'm going to try to get in 3 questions. I'm going to sneak in an editorial comment. I appreciate what my friend was just saying about the Palestinian Authority, but I think it's really important to remember the best way to empower Hamas is to disempower the Palestinian Authority. And we don't have great options. And if we want to make Hamas the inevitable successor to all Palestinian governance and leadership, completely disengaging from the Palestinian Authority is the best way to do it. In any event, I got 3 questions I'm going to try to fit in real quickly. I've been working with Howard Berman for years in trying to rewrite the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. It's been 60 years. You've got well over 200 goals, objectives, missions encrusted on that bill as amended over the years. which means legally, you're not really about any one thing, or you don't really have focus. We still have lots of Cold War vestiges. I think it's time to rewrite that bill with a contemporary focus that takes cognizance of the role of AID and the new missions that have occurred those 60 years. Can we count on your support and cooperation in trying to make that legislation happen?
It is absolutely the case that we are saddled with anachronisms in all kinds of places, also duplicative regulations and restrictions, and would love to work with you, at least.
Great.
I don't know about your bill, but anything to render the agency more fit for purpose for this moment in time, and the threats and challenges that we all know are very different than when some of these.
I wrote the last foreign aid authorization bill to become law. That was in 1986. I was a staff member for a young senator from Delaware called Joe Biden at that time in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I do think it's time we kind of refresh ourselves. And so I look forward to that cooperative relationship. We will get the draft of the bill to you. The second thing is democracy. We're seeing backsliding among some allies. We certainly experienced January 6th here in terms of how dramatic the challenge to democracy can be. We see countries like Burma, Myanmar, that were partners actually in democratic parliamentary building that have now experienced military coups overthrowing democratic institutions. The NED is funded by AID. It's funded by Congress. It does great work both through NDI and IRI. Is it time, are you personally taking an interest in reviewing that work and looking for ways to bolster it and lessons learned from the good, the bad, and the ugly in our experiences?
Well, I think this is another example of really important programming that continued over time. Maybe it was tweaked here or there, but I'm absolutely with my team giving it a fresh look. I think we need better rapid response capacity, more of a focus on anti-corruption, looking at the reform openings that exist in very few places, but in a place like Sudan right now, and being able to move more quickly to support reformist partners. I could go on, but the short answer is yes. I think bringing fresh eyes to this file is essential at this moment.
And let me commend one thought to you in that review. It's really important to remember, democracy is built from the bottom up, not the top down. A lot of our efforts over the years have funded programs at the national level, parliamentary level. We got to focus on the village level. And that's where democracy succeeds or fails ultimately. And that's what builds a strong infrastructure. And I know you know that. So I'd be glad to work with you on that as well. And finally, Haiti. After the earthquake, billions of dollars poured into Haiti. So it's not like Haiti didn't get sufficient aid. The question is, what went wrong with all of that? And why weren't we more successful? And I just wonder what your thoughts are about how we approach that moving forward.
Well, I think governance has not been Haiti's friend. Enlightened leadership, never. And it's not clear that we made investments in local actors. I mentioned it in my opening statement, a concern to your prior point about grassroots and bottom up. It was a lot of international actors providing those functions, and the indigenous capacity, maybe not what it should have been. I will say, that I've looked into this in part because of recent events to see how we would pivot now. But USAID has invested in 164 local clinics. 4 million people have healthcare they wouldn't otherwise have. We see the chaos. We see what isn't working. HIV prevalence is down to 2% in Haiti because of the HIV/AIDS programming that you all have supported over a long period of time. And we've just, USAID has worked with the government, previous government, to revamp the penal code, which is the first time it's been revamped since 1885, but now there's no parliament or no quorum in order to ratify that or put it in place. So, it's sort of like stopgap here or there and little piecemeal victories, but I can only pledge to you that I will look to see what those lessons learned are as we seek to move forward.
Thank you.
I now recognize Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Administrator, I want to thank you for your service. I've seen firsthand the remarkable work of USAID to be present for the typhoon recovery in the Philippines, the providing of food in South Sudan, the providing of schools in Afghanistan, just across the world. USAID has made such a difference, and I wish you well. In the past year, we've seen a historic relationship of Israel with its regional Arab allies, the successful Abraham Accords. The UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan have joined Egypt and Jordan in establishing relationships with Israel, paving the way to peace and recognition and stability in the region. What is the role of USAID in supporting these new relationships, and are there efforts that you can back up in expanding the diplomatic relationships in the region?
Well, let me embrace the premise. Critically important for every U.S. agency to do what it can to support these historic accords. A couple ideas for you, but open to thoughts of members who may have thought about this for longer. Someone mentioned earlier the Israeli Development Agency, Mashav. We have an MOU with Mashav, and in general, seeing Israel do more to bring innovation and agriculture internationally. We've done a partnership with them in Guatemala recently on rain catch water. But thinking through about, we also have MOUs with Qatar, Tunisia, Jordan, Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, I should say. Thinking through with MOUs with both actors, might there be a possibility of doing something trilateral? And then last thing, just there's something called the Middle East Regional Cooperation Program, and it's joint research projects that we can also do, bringing our development professionals from these different, basically parts of the Middle East together to work on, for example, drought-resistant crop innovation, or the kind of research that can help deal with climate adaptation. I mean, every country in the region has similar challenges in this regard with regard to water and agricultural returns given the changing climate. So those are like this research capacity, and then the question of trilateral cooperation in third countries are just a couple of the ideas that I've had. But again, I think it's a really important thing to do. And then the last thing, maybe I'd just say about Sudan, making sure that we spend the resources that have been, have sort of come out of that process loosely in support of the civilian transition in Sudan. That's something that would support the Abraham Accords, but also be dual use in supporting a rare bright spot in terms of democratization.
And I appreciate that response. That's really very positive. Additionally, I share the concerns of Congressman Brad Sherman and Congressman Steve Chabot that with Hamas launching Iranian rockets, almost 4,500 in the past couple of months into Israel, and there needs to be a rebuilding. But gosh, they're the people who created, but for the rockets, there would be no need for rebuilding. But every effort in the past to provide aid ended up strengthening Hamas. And so what safeguards are you going to put in place?
Well, first of all, anything that goes into Gaza, as you know, probably from your travels, goes through that very stringent vetting process that the Israeli government itself presides over. And so we work really closely with the government of Israel on anything that goes in. Our grantees are international organizations or American organizations. Gaza projects are subjected to a third layer of vetting, which is more than in any other part of the world. We vet not only the prime awardees, and not only the subprime, but the sub because of concerns about this. So I mean, this is something, again, that we have an interest in educating people and helping the civilians in that area recover, and we have an interest in keeping our resources away from Hamas, and we do everything in our power to do so.
Another part of the world, a good news story. Over the weekend, there were elections in Moldova, and the attempt by Mr. Putin to intervene failed, I hope. And so what are we doing to assist the people of Moldova?
We want to, again, be in a position to move nimbly in a circumstance like this with the few bright spots that exist, and that election victory, I put a big exclamation mark, in seeing it. It's supposed to be a a much tighter election. Given developments in Belarus and elsewhere, it's really important that we support reformers within the government. They are in a pro-American, pro-European direction, looking at any technical assistance we can give, and then continuing to support civil society, which was a big part of why those reformers were, I think, have been able to establish their strong majority.
Gentlemen's time
Thank you for your good work. I yield back.
Gentlemen's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida, who's the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chairman Meeks. Thanks, Administrator Power. It is really wonderful to have you before the committee and to have you doing this important work on behalf of our country. I want to thank you for the work that's already been done to revitalize USAID, to reaffirm the United States' place in the world through robust foreign assistance and provision of humanitarian assistance. I want to add my voice to those of my colleagues in support of vaccine diplomacy and the need for the United States to continue to provide vaccines to those in need around the world, particularly areas of the world that have struggled with access, like the Caribbean and Latin America. As you know, Chairman Meeks, as he said earlier, led a delegation last week to Israel. We had the opportunity to spend time with our USAID mission director and staff and several implementing partners. They have a tremendous task ahead of them, rebuilding the mission so they can resume the distribution of assistance to the West Bank and Gaza. I want, before asking my question, I just want to point out, Administrator, what you know and what I think we all understand, but the point needs to be made again. Humanitarian assistance and development assistance for the Palestinian people is assistance that contributes to the health and well-being and prosperity of Palestinians, which ultimately benefits not just the Palestinians, but it benefits Israel, it benefits the stability, contributes to the stability of the region. And I support the resumption of humanitarian and development assistance. But there is a lot of work to be done after the past 3 years of no assistance at all. And I would just ask you how and where USAID is in prioritizing the projects that it's restarting, and what you're doing to assure that you're working in full compliance, of course, with current law, and that specifically includes the important Taylor Force Act, which this committee is so strongly behind.
Thank you, Congressman. Great to see you again. So I think for starters, we are programming $20 million in support of just humanitarian efforts in the West Bank and Gaza. And here again, I want to stress 2 NGOs and UN organizations who are providing emergency shelter, food and relief items. So as well as healthcare, given that many of the clinics are no longer functioning. Separate from that, then, we are looking to move out on, and have begun to slowly, on the question of how to use FY20 and 21 ESF funds to support development in the West Bank and Gaza. And again, I feel like this can sometimes be an abstraction. Do you assist the Palestinians? And some people think that that means the Palestinian Authority. Some people think it means, some subset of the people. But just to concretize what those funds would be used for: the East Jerusalem Hospital Network, livelihoods and small business recovery, basic needs, food vouchers and the like, youth employment, again, bearing in mind what youth do when they don't have employment, and there are people who want to radicalize them, really, I think, in our collective interest. And that's job skills, vocational training and the like. And then civil society organizations that hold the Palestinian Authority and accountable, as well as infrastructure repair. I think Congressman Sherman mentioned MEPA, Nita Lowey's legacy, and which exists thanks to the work of many of you. I hope we can talk about that at some point over the course of the hearing. But that's another example of something we're not yet in a position to obligate because it doesn't kick in. MEPA doesn't formally start where we can move funds until.
Wait, Administrator Power, I'm sorry. I am going to please continue down that path. I promised we promised our dear friend Congressman Lowy that we would be vigilant here. So if you could speak to how USAID is working within the interagency structure to make sure that MEPA is seen not just as additional program or funds, but really a policy tool that can help work toward peace.
Okay, so first we should all say, hi, Congresswoman Lowy, because we know she's watching, and was going to hold you accountable and me accountable and everybody else accountable if we didn't. Okay, so in brief, I think we're finally picking up some momentum here on this with the transition from one administration to the next. We have our designated federal official now has been selected, Megan Doherty. She's the Deputy Assistant Administrator, so she will work this day-to-day at USAID. Congresswoman Pelosi has taken up her responsibility and has named our first board member, Robert Wexler, who some of you know. As you know, the chair and ranking of the 4 oversight committees for USAID each have the ability to name one board member, as do the majority and minority leaders of the House and Senate. So that's how we will constitute our board. Once the board is constituted, I will be in a position then to exercise my responsibility to name the chair of the board. Money cannot flow statutorily until the end of December, but you should be seeing drafts of the charter for MEPA and the membership balance sort of documents as we think about how to constitute that board as a whole and kind of what the rules governing the board. The board is supposed to weigh in, according to statute, as you know, on the nature of projects that we will be pursuing to enhance people-to-people ties. I should say DFC is moving sooner. They're by statute able to move in June, and they've announced that 3.5 million, I believe, out of the 50 million, they will be moving out to look about the kinds of private sector investments that can be made, again, to further this cause of people-to-people ties.
Great. Thanks so much, Administrator.
I now recognize Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you for coming and kind of answering our questions and concerns. I want to keep this as much as possible with respect in the realm of the appropriations request to USAID, but I can't help but look, I just must ask, because past performance is indicative of what future actions might be. Can you kind of lead us into your judgment regarding the UN resolution 2334, which essentially said that occupied lands included the historically Jewish lands and historic sites, the Temple Mount, the Mount of Olives, a 2,500-year-old cemetery, had the hospital there. I mean, to me, it's just outrageous. And the fact that just a simple no vote as opposed to an abstention, ostensibly the biggest and most important vote at that moment of your career and your lifetime, you abstained, and of course then that went through. I just am interested in, and it was, I think at the time, I don't think it's a secret that President Obama was not a fan of Netanyahu, and I don't know if it was a personal thing or not, but in the interest of the United States and our foreign interest, and of course our greatest ally, Israel, I just kind of like to know what the thought process was regarding that decision, that vote, and how was it good for Israel? How was it good for America? How did it discourage the BDS movement? Can you walk us through that?
I'm here obviously to talk about USAID and the responsibility I have to run this agency.
I get that.
Yeah.
I get that, but your judgment, once we appropriate the money, you're here to talk about an appropriations, and once we appropriate the money, you're going to have a significant decision-making role day to day on how that money is spent. And I think it's important for the members of this committee, the taxpayers that may be watching, the citizens that we represent, to just kind of have a mind's eye into the judgment that goes into these earth changing and altering situations. And so in all candor, I just, maybe there's something we don't know, and I don't want to color this as something that it isn't. So if there's something that's not obvious to us that on the inside that we didn't know at the time and may be divulged now, we'd sure like to know that.
Okay, so let me do a couple of things since we're going to go back in time. So as UN ambassador, I secured the recognition of Yom Kippur as a UN holiday for the first time in the history of the UN.
which is great, but it still
No,
doesn't.
I'm going to get to your question. Okay, we still have time. If you want to go back in time, we're going to go back in time. I convened the first ever UN General Assembly on condemning anti-Semitism in the very chamber where the Zionism is Racism resolution was passed years before. I secured Israel's integration into bodies from which it had been excluded for the entire life of its membership in the UN. And yes, in the tail end of the administration, President Obama instructed me to vote for a resolution that was intended to preserve prospects for a two-state solution as they slipped further and further away. You've mentioned aspects of the resolution. The resolution also condemned incitement and violence and terrorism. It did, in fact, condemn settlements, which had been the longstanding policy of administrations from both parties. And the view was that basically neither party should take unilateral steps that would push the communities of the region further from peace.
So I don't want to put
you asked if there was anything you didn't know about the resolution. I would urge you, if you're interested in going back to, I think it was December 2016,
right.
My explanation of vote at the time, which is quite fulsome, explains why we didn't vote no, why we didn't vote yes, why we abstained, why the UN has been historically biased in having too many resolutions against Israel, but how the content of the resolution, by and large,
so it sounds like essentially
bipartisan consensus
to preserve the two-state solution. I mean, essentially that was. I mean, like I said, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I get all the other great things, and we appreciate them, but I just really want to understand what the feeling is that by abstaining, that would help preserve some kind of. I guess ambivalence or what have you towards a two-state solution. Is that generally it with the remaining 10 seconds?
I think the idea was that unilateral steps from both sides would be destructive to the cause of a two-state solution. And this was a way of signaling the parties, the United States position, which again was the longstanding position of Republican and Democratic administrations.
I appreciate the candor. Thank you.
I now recognize Representative Karen Bass of California, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights for 5 minutes.
Well, once again, let me thank our chairman and ranking member for holding this hearing. And it is wonderful to see, Madam Ambassador. You did such a fabulous job when you were at the United Nations. And I remember a couple of trips we took to Africa together. So I love that you are at USAID now and know that your leadership will continue in a very positive way. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One, I know you've already responded to questions around Ethiopia, but I wanted to specifically ask you about what is happening to women and girls there and wanting to know if we have any targeted support. The other thing is that I know that in some regions, especially in the Tigray region, that there's concern about famine. And I'd like to know if you have any updates there. Have we reached that point? Do we have targeted resources in the budget? And when you're done with that, I want to ask you about Mozambique.
Thank you. Quickly then, let me say, and I don't know if I said this earlier, so our assessment is that 900,000 people in Tigray are facing famine conditions. That's as of about 2.5 weeks ago. And so unfortunately, in the meantime, while there has been a shift, as you know, in conditions on the ground, there has not been a shift in terms of a big influx of assistance. Quite the contrary. The convoy that reached Mekelle, I believe, was it yesterday or the day before, took days. It should take 7.5 hours. And so we are deeply concerned, but the fact that people have not been able to communicate from within Tigray, the fact that telecommunications equipment isn't even being allowed into Tigray has made it hard to update those numbers and get the kind of access that we seek. Our programming is also oriented, a lot of it is just food assistance and food vouchers, cash vouchers, I should say, in places that markets still have accessible food. But we do have gender-based programming as well. I'd have to get back to you on the numbers in terms of the share of what we're spending there. But it is as ghastly, and you and I have traveled to some pretty difficult parts of the world where atrocities have been part of the equation. But this level of willful, where the perpetrators of sexual violence and mass rape are saying, your womb will never be used again to give birth to a Tigrayan. I mean, just so ethnically motivated use of sexual assault as a weapon of war. It's horrific. And these are reports of people who've come out of the country who might be, let's say, in Eastern Sudan, but they're also from our partners inside who are providing some of this counseling. And it's so widespread that women are stepping forward, all the cultural taboos, not all of them, but many of them melting away. It is so prevalent that women and girls are coming forward and sharing their testimonies at a scale you would not generally expect, given some of the cultural norms and so forth.
And I think it would be helpful to us also to get some of that information in terms of the testimonials, because since there is so much disagreement about what is going on, all of us represent, not all of us, many of us represent communities as our constituents. And it's important to get that information out. I wanted to ask you about northern Mozambique. We're planning, hopefully, a congressional delegation to Mozambique. We have the wonderful opportunity there with the discovery of natural gas, and at the same time, the problem of an outbreak of terrorist cells. And so I wanted to know how USAID is supporting on the humanitarian side what is going on in northern Mozambique.
Yes, just to talk about the part of the country where ISIS does appear to have established a foothold, Cabo Delgado. That has become very difficult for us and our implementing partners to reach. There are issues with infrastructure to begin with roads and bridges damaged by flooding and cyclones last year. But our records, or what we can glean, indicates that 41 of 128 health facilities in the province are non-functional. And that's against a backdrop of more and more attacks. We do continue to operate, but it is just very, very challenging. Elsewhere in Mozambique, there are the same kind of COVID fallout needs that we've seen elsewhere. We have investments in health security. We're looking, of course, through COVAX and bilaterally at vaccine donations, getting kids back into school after it's, sort of the problem set that we're dealing with across sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. But the ISIS dynamic specifically requires us to really look at our programming as a whole. We have amazing conservation and environmental and natural resource work in Mozambique. We've had really flagship programs out of the country, but we haven't done countering violent extremism work prior to this point, and it's really ISIS's arrival that forces us to think about how to potentially divide the pie in a different way.
Thank you. You're muted, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, you're muted.
I now recognize Representative Adam Kinzinger of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you and the ranking member for organizing this. Administrator Power, thank you for being with us and spending some time. Very much appreciate it. I just want to ask you a few questions. So earlier this week, unfortunately, we saw video evidence of the Taliban executing 20 Afghan commandos after they had surrendered. By all accounts, the willful killing of a combatant who has surrendered is a war crime. These crimes just are further evidence that the Taliban can't be trusted to uphold international law. Have you been made aware of any threats made against USAID employees or any individual who works under grants and cooperative agreements with like NDI or IRI? And how can you ensure that they're going to be protected from those barbaric actions?
Well, first of all, thank you for sincerely for your leadership on this. Even the way you formulated the question reflects your knowledge of the distinction drawn in the SIV law between contracting partners and grant and cooperative agreement partners, which is really challenging to try to describe to Afghans who've given so much of themselves for these programs over time. So I hope that we will find a way as an administration to work with you to make sure that that kind of arbitrary distinction does not prove material when it comes, if and when it comes to needing to evacuate and resettle people. And as you know, we've given a lot of thought to what a refugee resettlement program would look like if the SIV law remains what it is. The second dimension, which you know well, is how long you have to have served at USAID. About half of our current staff have served under the 2-year requirement, some barely under. And so that also, like, once you're a target for working with USAID, you're a target. And you asked if we hear about credible threats. Yes, Afghans who work, whether with the military as interpreters and translators, where you've been such a champion, or people who are out wearing USAID badges and doing girls' education programming or irrigation programming. Absolutely, they're vulnerable, and we have a responsibility to them. I think, again, thinking through what the SIV portion of this looks like and how we expedite processing, probably in third countries, because we're not going to expedite it enough to be able to meet people where they are with the fears that they have. But also thinking through, what other forms of resettlement can be made available to those who might fall outside the tenors of the law. But last thing I'd say, and sorry to use up so much time on this, but it's so important, is just that, I think that we don't want to lose sight of the fact that our security relationship with the Afghan National Forces lives on. And that fundamentally is what our staff and our implementing partners are asking a lot about. What is the training going to look like? What is the maintenance of the helicopters going to look like? They want to stay, right? They want assurances that if everybody wants a plan B because of the speed with which the security situation is deteriorating, but the public spiritedness of these individuals, which they've shown throughout the life of USAID's programs in USAID, in USAID's programs in Afghanistan, I mean, this is what we want to respect and protect. And if we can get organized in the way that I think we're congealing to do with contingency planning, their first preference is to stay and just know we'll have their backs if the time comes.
Yeah, thank you. It's a sad situation. Let me skip ahead. I want to ask about, we live in a country where there's a lot of people not taking a vaccine, and there's a lot of people around the world desperate for a vaccine. And so we know that the U.S. has donated billions of dollars to support vaccine distribution to low-income countries. They've been used to deliver vaccines to parts of the world that would otherwise continue to suffer from this pandemic. Unfortunately, last month, the WHO welcomed the Assad regime to its executive board. Can you assure this committee that the administration is committed to standing up for human rights as well as the well-being of the Syrian people? And also, can you detail how the USAID will help with the vaccination of the Syrian people while ensuring that Assad doesn't benefit from that?
The answer to your first question is yes. Will I stand up for the human rights of the Syrian people? Yes. In terms of programming and how we reach the Syrians, I think because the share of developing country populations in sub-Saharan Africa and in our own hemisphere, that share is so small that has been reached with vaccines so far. We have not yet, I think, moved into thinking through exactly how for example, the populations in Northeast Syria are going to be reached. The distribution networks there would be much more challenging. Nor do I know, for example, if Sputnik or the Chinese government already have some deal cooked with Assad. So maybe if I could just take that offline and look at the wither vaccination Syria set of questions. Unless you have something specific in mind, but I
think
gentleman's time has expired.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just yield back. Thank you.
I now recognize Representative Bill Keating of Massachusetts, who's the chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, the Environment, and Cyber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. I associate myself with so many of my colleagues on all the pressing needs around the world. And certainly, in the last 2 decades, the USAID monies have decreased to the Europe and Eurasia areas as the socioeconomic conditions have improved and the EU is enlarged. That's understandable. It's not just all about money. There's so many issues that command our attention in Europe, and I just wanted to see if you will address them generally. I'll try and give you enough time to answer them. But I'm concerned with democratic backsliding there, the rise of anti-Semitism, civil rights issues, particularly with the LGBTQ plus community, and attacks on the rule of law, And certainly Russia and China are increasing their influence in this area, and we have to counter that. So if you could address generally the issue, but I'll mention a couple of bullet points. In particular, Ukraine, what we're doing on anti-corruption issues and democratic process, Belarus and how we're affected by the June 13th limits that were put on our diplomatic and technical personnel there, the elections in Moldova and Bulgaria, and how that's important to really reaffirm our efforts at democratic resiliency and election issues. And not to overlook the issue in Northern Ireland that is escalating in terms of violence and unrest, and our support for the International Fund for Ireland because of our concerns, many of us in Congress who are concerned with the progress made being lost with the Good Friday Agreement. So I gave you a lot, but I gave you a lot of time too.
Thank you. Maybe first just a general acknowledgement of what I've come to realize went on over the course of the last decade, which is, I mean, you know, and I'd count myself guilty of this, you know, many people just assuming the trajectory was going to go in a democratic, liberal direction, and believing that the gains that had been secured in the post-Cold War period were going to continue to, maybe there'd be a setback here or there, but that, you know, the fundamental divide between democracy and authoritarianism in that part of the world had been resolved. Putin was an outlier, but, you know, let's keep him an outlier, and things will continue to trend well. That's and our programming reflected that. I believe that you started to see significant cuts and even doing away with whole programs in the region starting in 2013. You might know better than me. And I would have been President Obama's human rights advisor around that time. And, you know, it seemed like what you would do. You would go to other parts of the world where progress hadn't been made. Well, we're not in that headspace anymore, and we recognize the battle for the soul of countries and communities is going on in every corner of the globe right now. And China and Russia are pumping, you know, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, depending on the country that we're talking about, into this battle for hearts and minds. On the specifics, I think Ukraine is an example of a place, in part because of the invasion, of course, of Crimea and Ukraine by Russia, that we picked up our funding sooner. And I think we have not the results that we would wish, but some pretty positive results on the anti-corruption front, with procurement reforms, dedicating USAID's resources to the local level rather than always working through the central government. As you know, policing has been a big part of the reform effort as well. That's partners other than USAID. Digitizing public services, so there's less capacity for corruption, more transparency. I could go on. I think Belarus, you put your finger on a big challenge there, just in terms of our footprint on the ground as Lukashenko has grown more and more repressive. But without getting into details here, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, you know, we have found a way to continue to support those people who are willing to brave it out inside Belarus, and to support those who've gone into exile and are seeking to influence the public debate and what's left of the protest movement from outside. I mean, Ireland, I guess I would just say that the U.S. will be contributing $2 million to the Ireland Fund. I think this is another, all the examples that we're talking about are examples where we have to marry diplomacy and policy with program, right? And it's the high level policy engagement of the kind that you can imagine President Biden is thoroughly committed to. He speaks to this every time he's given the opportunity to do so, but standing by the Good Friday Agreement and making sure that our diplomatic engagement reflects our recognition of the fragility of things in light of Brexit and some of the changes that are afoot in the wake of that. It's superficial, but so that's to the countries I think you mentioned.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ann Wagner of Missouri, who's the vice-ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for hosting the hearing, and I want to thank Administrator Powell for her time and her service. United States insistence on collaboration and self-sufficiency makes us the partner of choice for countries seeking a helping hand to grow their economies, improve health systems, fight corruption, and so on and so on. But with adversaries like Russia and China using the predatory development and economic initiatives to expand their malign influence across the developing world, we need to be smart, intentional, and creative in the way we use our resources to advance global prosperity. The previous administration, I think, was right to call for reforms to improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of our international aid bodies. And I'm hopeful that the new administration is continuing these modernizations. It has become clear that China and Russia do not have the best interest of their world partners at heart. And U.S. activities abroad, however, recognize the inherent worth of all people and leverage the boundless human capacity for generosity, cooperation, and ingenuity to overcome the global challenges. USAID's mission is more important than ever, and the United States must continue to play a leading role in helping vulnerable people from around the world build a better future. Ambassador Power, just a few days ago, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, or Gavi, announced it had agreed to purchase 550 million vaccines from the Chinese companies Sinopharm and Sinovac. These vaccines are not effective in stopping the spread of the virus. New York Times recently reported that the 10 countries experiencing the worst COVID outbreaks, 4 had fully inoculated 50 to 68% of their populations using mostly Chinese vaccines. How is USAID communicating to Gavi the pitfalls of participating in China's quote vaccine diplomacy campaign? I know the ranking member touched on this. In the future, how will the United States use its leadership role to ensure multilateral organizations are not purchasing these faulty vaccines?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the preamble and for this question, which, as you indicated, we've sort of touched upon. So let me see if I can sort of set the scene here. I mean, first of all, we should start with the core fact that when the Delta variant is raging around the world and supply is lacking globally because the Serum Institute of India pulled back hundreds of millions of vaccines that were supposed to go to COVAX because Europe is still, in the throes of the pandemic, hopefully coming out of it now with light at the end of the tunnel. Because our vaccine purchase of the Pfizer doses will start to come online in August.
Right.
We are in this sort of in-between period where a lot of people, and I'll get you the exact numbers, received first doses of AstraZeneca, for example, and thought that the Indian Serum Institute would be providing the second dose, and then those got, it was prohibited to export those in light of the devastation unfolding within India. So COVAX has found itself in this period in a very difficult spot. And when I say COVAX, it's not COVAX, it's developing countries. It's the 40 countries in the world.
Ambassador, if I could, since you touched on COVAX, I'm just so concerned that we're not adequately pushing back on the Chinese Communist Party's dangerous vaccine diplomacy. And I know that the WHO, COVAX shipments, they kind of fail to reflect the outsized role, I think, that the United States is playing in the global COVID-19 response. So is USAID communicating to the recipients that this assistance is a gift from the American people?
Yes, but just to finish the point, just simply on China, at that moment of need, that's the time to donate supply. We can have, there's a question of efficacy. When you have no vaccines, it may be that it becomes appealing to use one that is less effective than Moderna and Pfizer, but nonetheless a vaccine. That's the countries themselves have a choice as to whether they take those vaccines or they do not. China in general has promised hundreds of millions of vaccines and not delivered on those promises in many parts of the world. And so vaccine diplomacy actually isn't working out terribly well in certain quarters. But you raised the branding question. And
Right.
let me say that anything donated by the United States through COVAX, whether our 80 million surplus and the share of that goes through COVAX, or the 500 million Pfizer, which will all go through COVAX, all of that will be branded with the American flag. And what you're seeing now, we finally have this uptick where you see every day Bolivia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, doses of US donated vaccine arriving. That is going to be the drumbeat that we see going forward. And what we need to do is just bring more supply online, and it will be US vaccine diplomacy that ensures that countries break the back of this pandemic.
You're absolutely right. And I appreciate your work. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative David Cicilline of Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Ambassador Power. Delighted to see you and really grateful for your diplomatic and development leadership on behalf of our country around the world, and thrilled to have you back in the government. I want to just focus on 2 issues. One, there's been some discussion with respect to LGBTQI communities around the world, and it represents a very small part of the human rights funding for your agency. And for some reason, the Gender Equity and Equality Action Fund has not been used to support LGBTQI people and organizations around the world. And I'm just wondering whether you can commit to at least looking at using an appropriate portion of that, since there's so little pot of funding at the agency, and the community, as Chairman Keating mentioned, is facing tremendous violence. We had our first hearing in the full committee and also in the subcommittee about the plight of LGBTQI people around the world, and it's harrowing and dangerous, and just hope you will commit to using that fund as well.
Well, I will certainly commit to looking at what more we can do on LGBTQI issues, whether out of that fund or out of other DRG money. As it stands, as I understand it, we are only meeting about 1/6 of the identified need that missions identify, because they come to us, of course, as headquarters and say, look, this is the kind of rapid response or legal defense that we can offer to push back on this legislation or to protect these individuals. And so working with DRL and others in the government, we'll look at what more we can do.
Great. And I think the other side of that is to be sure that it's also going to the right kind of effort. So you may be aware that Open Democracy reported recently that some USAID funded clinics around the world are promoting conversion therapy, which of course is a very dangerous and discredited practice that perpetuates stigma and discrimination and violence against the LGBTQI community. And I hope you will look at that issue and determine how you can ensure that our dollars are not being used to undermine protections of the LGBTQI community and the safety of the community by promoting and funding conversion therapy in places around the world.
Yes, I can commit to that. Conversion therapy is unacceptable, and USAID opposes it. We neither plan for, obviously, nor approve payment for activities that amount to torture and foster also broader violence against LGBTQI people. I can get into the details of the clinic in question in the report, but maybe we can do that offline.
Absolutely look forward to talking more about that. I also want to mention, obviously, and you know this very well, women and girls in conflict or post-conflict zones remain particularly vulnerable to everything from violence to barriers to healthcare and education. And I just love to hear some about how USAID and how you in particular are thinking about funding in areas like Africa, Middle East, and Asia toward women-led or women and girls-centric civil society organizations, and how that might help women and girls increase their influence within developing nations. And before I give you all the time to answer that, I just want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Deutsch about our trip to the Middle East and about the importance of humanitarian and development assistance in the Palestinian territories and the opportunity for vaccine diplomacy that several of my colleagues have mentioned. But if you could speak to this particular issue of women and girls with the remaining minute and a half, thank you. And thank you again for your service.
Thank you so much. So one of the things that we have done as an administration, and this is led very much by the White House, is built out of, I think, what was a very successful effort, the Gender Development Program, which focused on prosperity for women and women's empowerment. Because of the effects of COVID on women and girls, whether domestic violence or economic disempowerment, we have sort of taken the core of that programming, which we will continue, and obligated $200 million for the fund that you mentioned in the context of LGBTQI, this GEEA fund. And I'm excited about that because I think it gives us the potential to look into, how do we enable women to enter and advance in the workplace? How do we promote women's entrepreneurship? How do we remove barriers, do that barrier analysis where USAID missions can be so helpful, engaging governments on what regulations need to change, what employer practices need to change, are there things we can do on social and cultural norms? But I think what it potentially allows us to do, because there'll be a plus up, hopefully in the funding in this GEA fund, is actually look at the COVID specific effects, whether on school, as you mentioned, or on women not returning to the workplace at the pace of their male counterparts, or girls who come out of school not returning to school at the pace of their boy counterparts, as well as gender-based violence and other dimensions of the sort of COVID-specific exacerbators of the underlying inequality.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Darrell Issa of California for 5 minutes. Mr. Issa, Representative Issa, I saw him a second ago. We will come back to Representative Issa. I will now go to Representative Mass for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the time. Ma'am, thank you for your testimony today. I want to start with a question going back in time. In 2012, the United States taxpayers, let's be specific, taxpayers sent $396 million to the Palestinian people in terms of USAID. Can you tell me what they got for that?
I was not running USAID at the time, so I don't think it's appropriate to speculate, but I can get you the full laydown as a historic matter.
I'm asking more generally, what did the US people get out of this? What did we gain? Let's move a year later, 2013, $357 million of out of people's pockets went to the Palestinian people. What did the American people get for that?
Well, since you don't seem interested in specifics, which is perfectly appropriate, I think I get the gist of your question. I can generally speak to what the American people get from our investments in these communities. So in part, what we do is we foster cross-line and cross-territory interaction between Israelis and Palestinians. So we also fund education of the kind that otherwise many Palestinian children would have no access to. It's actually one of the most literate populations in the world, in part because of the investments that we've made bilaterally and also through UN agencies. We fund at times like this, if there's acute humanitarian emergencies, we fund food so that people actually have food and shelter. And that's, I think, consistent with the compassion of the American people, who, when they see people in need around the world, they open their hearts and are very generous just at meeting humanitarian needs. I think I know that there is radicalization and there are terrorists and there is incitement to violence and all of the things that make us that are just deeply abhorrent that have gone on in different parts of that region. But the investments that we make in education, in economic development, in small business growth, I can't give you the counterfactual of how much worse the radicalization would be if we didn't make those investments. But I can tell you there's a reason that the Israeli security establishment for generations has supported this programming, because it's it actually neutralizes.
I appreciate your responses and I appreciate your opining on it. It's exactly what I was asking for, so I appreciate that. I would say it's not the job of the American people to fund the Department of Education for the Palestinian Authority, especially given the things that we know that have been acknowledged that go into their textbooks. I would also touch on this in terms of as it relates to the two-state solution, which you have been a supporter of. Secretary of State Blinken has been before our committee, has fully acknowledged that it is Hamas that is entirely in control of Gaza. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, our Secretary to the UN, has fully acknowledged before this committee that it is Hamas that is in control of Gaza. And in that, if you're looking to support a second state, what you're making is a second Iran, a second terror-led state. That's a fact. It's a fact that they're not holding elections because Hamas would win those elections. That's what both Blinken and Greenfield have both acknowledged in our committee, that they would win that election. And that's why Abbas is not holding elections there. And this is who we are funding. I would argue that your support for a two-state solution is wholly misguided. Do you believe that we would see anything other than a second terror-led state akin to Iran, which is what Iran is?
That seemed like a rhetorical question. That was a question?
That was a question.
And the question specifically is, do we support elections? I think it's important for...
do you believe that to create a second state would result in anything other than a second Iran, given that Blinken, Greenfield, others acknowledge Hamas is fully in control and would win an election?
I believe that in order to ensure the dignity and security of Israelis and of Palestinians, there have to be two states in the region, and that is why, again...
You think Israelis want a second Iran?
I don't think Israelis want a second Iran, but Israelis support the assistance that USAID provides in many of the programs that you're taking issue with. So I'm not sure that you and the Israeli government perspective is all that well synced up.
They can have a vote in Congress.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Samantha of California, who is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Powell, for your service to our country and continued service. I want to follow up on a little bit of my colleague, David Cicilline, touched on. One of the areas that I have a deep interest in is global fragility and some of the fragile states, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And we've seen with the pandemic, an acceleration or a worsening of some of that fragility. I worked with your predecessor, Administrator Green, on looking at some of the most effective programs that we could, and again, certainly appreciated the prior administration's desire to focus on women and girls, which I do strongly support as one of our best investments to create stability, that investment in women and girls. But I also did point out to the prior administration that it is very difficult to achieve the goals that you want to, empowering women, if you don't address reproductive rights, if you don't address and empower people for pregnancy spacing. And one area that we've seen every 4 or 8 years, the global gag rule, we rescinded, and I applaud the Biden administration for rolling back some of what the Trump administration had put in place. But we can't really do this every 4 or 8 years, going back and forth. And on this issue of pregnancy spacing and the global gag rule, we've introduced the Global HER Act to try to find a way to not go back and forth. And I'd just be curious from the USAID perspective, the effectiveness and how we can bring back some of our international partners who were working in the space of reproductive freedoms, of pregnancy spacing, and some of the things that we certainly could do in Congress, but also could empower USAID to do.
Well, I guess I would just underscore the importance of voluntary family planning of the kind that USAID programs support. We have seen, in fact, Senator Shaheen was mentioning this to me in the earlier hearing, tens of millions of unwanted pregnancies this year because COVID made it impossible to access voluntary family planning. Certainly, swings back and forth in terms of our programming make it hard to sustain results and to be predictable and build the kinds of partnerships that are transparent.
1 minute, I'm going on, and I'll be on for 5 minutes.
That are that are in our interest. And so stability in that regard is certainly welcome. USAID follows the law, and the laws are what they are. But it has been important, I think, to engage again in programming that is so vital to women and girls, especially at this time, given what COVID, the disproportionate effects of this pandemic on women and girls around the world.
Well, absolutely. So I certainly look forward to working, and I appreciate that language, voluntary family planning, and that should be something that Democrats and Republicans can come together around, because if we look at our own country, the vast majority of women in America, Democrats, Republicans, evangelical, have had access to voluntary family planning, and we want to protect that access. Switching gears, in my subcommittee, one area that we focus on is obviously what's happening in Burma, in Myanmar, and it does unfortunately look like this will drag on for a while, and we do see some of the suffering that the people in Burma are facing. Certainly USAID and workers and partners in the region are doing what they can to provide basic assistance, medicine, foods, et cetera, in terms of the kind of cross-border assistance. And on prior hearings, when we talked about how we best can support the people in Burma, it has been trying to get that cross-border aid over. Is there anything that you and the people that you work for and the NGOs that are on the ground need from us in Congress to help better support the people of Burma?
Well, the food needs are intense, in part also because there has been so much displacement since the February coup. So on top of the longstanding ethnic conflicts or the longstanding repression and ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, the fact that you've seen people rise up and then be greeted with the cudgel of the coup leaders and of the military is extremely difficult. So I think we're providing humanitarian assistance to around 600,000 displaced and conflict affected people within Burma. You ask a good question on the cross-border dimension of it. That's something, of course, we've had to do in northern Syria. It's something that we've had to do in South Sudan and in different parts of its history in Sudan as well. I would have to dig into that myself. I'm not actually sure what the gating issue is in terms of going cross-border. Our partners, as you know, they are so dedicated to reaching that population that I will definitely come back to you if there's something we need.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Darrell Issa of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, one of the good and the bad things about you and I having been around 20 years looking at some of these issues is that the history. That's the good news. The bad news is that we're in the same position we were in or worse than we were 20 years ago. And let me just go through 2 areas. I know that many of the questions you've had to take today had to do with the Palestinians. But when I came into office and Bill Clinton was still in the White House, we came very close to a historic agreement. There was goodwill. The Israeli people were willing to cede land for peace, but it didn't happen. At that time, there were significant requests under the new administration, the Bush administration, and Congress provided that money, including directly and indirectly aid for the Palestinian Authority's not military, but police forces and the like. And we went through now 2 decades of various forms of aid, much of it direct from the U.S. over the years, but an awful lot of it through partners in the Gulf and so on. It is clear that we're actually have a less favorable voting population in Gaza today, and probably the same based on polling I've seen from Zogby, in the West Bank. So we've lost the hearts and minds of these people. Today, free and fair elections, as they're called, would likely favor Hamas. When you're looking at the aid for the Palestinian people, don't we have a conundrum that the aid you provide does not seem to be convincing these people to come to the table or even to vote for moderation? And I'd like to have a brief answer on how you feel about that after 20 years of being a student of this.
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's a very fair question. I think that the same question, we could go through any one of USAID's files, given the state of the world today, exacerbated also by the pandemic, and want to know, like, what good has it done? I think it was Congressman Masters asking a version of this question. I guess what I'd say,
and Director, I considered going to Nigeria, which has massive oil reserves, and we continue to provide massive aid. But I decided that one bad area was enough.
Okay, well, I'm waiting. You did say there was a second, so I look forward to hear who the second is. But I guess, there are a lot of different reasons we provide development and humanitarian assistance around the world. I think the fact is that Israeli security, Israeli advances also economically, which of course are tremendous. Having a lot of instability and violence in the area, in the Palestinian territories, that's not good for anybody. And as it happens, these investments in education have given Palestinians the chance to, especially in the Palestinian territories, the chance to travel and work in the region, to bring incomes home. There are thriving businesses. That is a good thing for the people who live in those communities. And so the idea that that we are going to be sort of asking in return, for our, for everything on our wish list, it just doesn't always work quite that transactional.
Okay. Yeah,
and because my ability and welfare of human beings.
Thank you. And because my time is short, I want to be brief and pivot to Lebanon, which enjoys now half a century of Palestinian refugees still there, 500,000 of them, as other countries as a result. But I want to just briefly say, Lebanon has become effectively a failed state in the last 18 months. And when you're looking at the aid programs you've historically had, could you comment on the fact that this went from being an almost developing country at the top end to one that now rivals many of the worst that you're dealing with?
I don't disagree with the characterization. I would not have thought, and maybe you wouldn't have either 3 or 4 years ago, that we would be looking at Lebanon as a candidate for large shares of our limited pool of emergency assistance. We provided $70 million in emergency aid in FY21. This with one of the most vibrant civil societies and business communities and so forth. But the pandemic has compounded those pre-existing challenges. I think it comes back, as it does in so many places, including close to home in the Northern Triangle, to governance and inability to escape this trajectory except through political and economic reforms. And we have to look to Lebanese leaders to see what's happening now within the country. It's not just garbage not getting collected. It's people now, being dependent on international assistance, proud, people who a few years ago were employed and running their own businesses and so forth and fully capable of contributing to their economies, having no place to turn because the governance challenges, I think, have really undermined some of the economic potential that existed.
Gentlemen, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Representative Andy Levin of Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me well? I couldn't hear you too well, so okay. Thanks. So great to see you, Ambassador. Thanks for giving us all this time. I would love to ask you about so many places around the world, but let me start with Haiti. You spoke a bit about it earlier with Chairman Meeks himself. And I mean, what we're witnessing right now in the horrible aftermath of the first assassination of a president there in 106 years, since 1915, is a fight amongst power players. And there's a lot of talk about who will come out on top, but there's not so much talk about what the Haitian people believe should happen. I'm not talking about the elites, the tiny few percent who speak French, but I'm talking about all the Haitian people, as represented by groups of as many as 100 groups in civil society that are coming together to seek a real deep transition to democracy. The administration has continued to push for Haitian elections to occur ASAP, even though there's no evidence to suggest that an election could be carried out in a manner that's free, fair, could produce credible results. And these civil society organizations are saying, stop rushing us, listen to us, let us come together and reestablish the conditions for democracy. Now, you're someone who's been there to witness so many nations at this kind of crossroads firsthand. So would you agree that what the United States should be doing is to actually support the creation of conditions so that whenever an election could happen, whether it's 6 months or a year, 18 months, that it would actually be free, that political parties could campaign, that people could vote fairly, and that the Haitian people in particular need to support the plan rather than having solutions imposed either by an elite or by outside actors?
Well, you certainly have, Chairman Meeks had made this point, and it's a very powerful argument. And I have seen elections in my long life of going to broken places. I have seen elections rushed by the United States, including arguably elections that gave rise to some of the dynamics that we were just describing in the Middle East. But I've also seen spoilers, finding a way to undermine the kind of bottom up, kind of flowering and process that you're describing. And so I guess it's either different views. I think within my own team, the people who know Haiti best, who are there at our mission, in a very destabilizing position. As you know, at our embassy, 500 people were crowded up against the embassy, civilians, not our staff. Our staff were doing their work. But it's particularly in light of the assassination, when there is no legitimate authority, the question of whether, if you could get a sort of pact among these self-interested actors along the line in support of the kind of vision that you and many of our civil society partners are articulating, then you could imagine. But if you have people using this interregnum, this vacuum, this power vacuum, simply to consolidate their own power. I mean, I don't know that there are 10 members of parliament currently seated, right? There's not even
10, there are only 10 senators. Well, let me just say to you, and that, I first went to Haiti in 1980 as a college student to study the effect of USAID's role in the country. And I concluded that our main impact was propping up the Duvalier dictatorship through insisting on cash crops, through supporting teaching of French rather than Creole in schools, through 100 things that we, whatever. But I believe in the Haitian people, Ambassador. They can do this if we can look beyond Pétionville, can look and see the unions, the business groups, the teachers, the health groups, all the different groups in the society who want to work together. And I would love to work with you on your team on this, as well as the NSC and the State Department. Chairman Meeks has been a real leader on this. We've recently recreated a Haiti caucus in the House, which I'm honored to co-chair, and it's been super active. So I hope to work with you to have a real people-led solution to the situation in Haiti. Thanks so much.
I will follow up to understand better what you mean as a practical, sort of what the next steps are and how we deal with the vacuum at the same time. I'm very interested.
Perfect.
Gentleman's time is expired. I now recognize Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee for 5 minutes. You're on mute, Tim. Still can't hear you. Can't hear you. Still can't hear you. Let's try to figure out the technical difficulties and we'll come back to you. So now we'll go to Rep. Young Kim for 5 minutes. You're recognized, Representative Young Kim.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this event and the hearing. I want to thank Administrator Power for joining us today. As Vice Ranking Member on Asia Subcommittee, I would like to start by focusing on USAID support for Pacific Island nations. As you know, Congress has supported the Indo-Pacific strategy through increased funding for a wide range of foreign aid activities in the East Asia and South and Central Asia regions, aimed at working with our partners to coordinate foreign assistance efforts to push back on China's influence in Asia. I see within the USAID's developmental assistance budget, there is about $445 million that's allocated for EAP. And how much of that is allocated for Pacific Islands region? And can you explain that for us, how this request prioritizes the Pacific Islands?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Just to say that, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but when I was UN ambassador, I benefited every day from the relationship that the United States had with the Pacific Islanders, including on really tough votes where they almost always at least stood with us. And especially as China now seeks to sway people into their column at the UN to rewrite the rules of the road, this coalition of countries they've really stood with us in tough diplomatic circumstances. So to your question very specifically, we have, speak to the staff first and then to the budget. We have tripled our staff actually between now and the end of 2020. And we have quadrupled the amount of humanitarian and development assistance from $20 million to $87 million. I think what we'd be looking at also is thinking about climate resilience, climate adaptation, working with Secretary Kerry to think through what more we can do in that area, as well as food security, because as you know, these extreme weather events are making it harder and harder for the agricultural, survival really to occur on these islands. So we're also, last thing I'd say is just we're working on the electrification of Papua New Guinea. It's 13% electrified. We're looking to get it 70% electrified by 2030. That's just one specific example of the kind of work we do.
Great. Well, thank you. Developing nations across the Indo-Pacific have been very clear that their primary development objective is hard infrastructure. And China has been able to greatly expand its influence offering such hard infrastructure. So how is the United States working in cooperation with our allies offering an alternative? So obviously we're talking about preserving our US influence. So do we need to further expand our capabilities related to hard infrastructure? And does this request support such efforts?
I think it's a very fair question. I mean, I think the question in general, what's our development alternative, to the Belt and Road Initiative is a question on many of our minds. And we have a lot of comparative advantages, the fact that we're not extractive, that we support civil society, that an advantage that they, or at least something that they have sold as their advantage is this hard infrastructure set of investments. We do that more through the World Bank and through our multilateral partners. But if you look at President Biden's announcement at the G7 around the Build Back Better world alternative, really, to the way China's been doing infrastructure development, I think that's the space in which we're going to look at, whether it's health systems or transportation or gender equity, what are the components of the U.S. alternative? I don't think the 2022 request reflects the kind of delta that you're talking about, but I would watch that space. It feels like that is where this is going to get articulated as to what the U.S. development alternative is going to be.
Sure. Well, let me move on to Burma. How does administration's budget request reflect efforts to support the Rohingya and hold the Burmese military accountable and elevate the strain of about 1 million refugees on Bangladesh? And how is the COVID-19 impacting refugee populations in Cox's Bazar and host communities?
The conditions in Cox's Bazar, as you know, are really difficult. And the patience of the Bangladeshis is always something to engage diplomatically to sustain, given how many people they've been sheltering with no prospect of safe return. I think our budget request, and this is state and USAID, because PRM provides much of the refugee assistance. But I think it reflects, generous contributions to the UN agencies who are supporting those refugees in Cox's Bazar. It reflects support, in the case of USAID, for civil society organizations that have documented the atrocities against the Rohingya. I think in the state justice request, you'll see support for some of the efforts that have been made also to hold the generals accountable in international tribunals. That's not something, again, I've the details on because it's part of the state request, but those are some examples of at least trying to establish accountability for the horrors that have been perpetrated.
General Hake's time has expired.
Thank you, Ambassador.
I now recognize Representative Susan Wild of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Administrator Power, thank you so much for your service to our country and for being here today. I consider you to be one of our nation's leading human rights experts. And before you began serving in your current role as USAID Administrator, you spoke out against human rights violations that had been committed by the Duterte regime in the Philippines. From that perspective, from your perspective as a lifelong human rights advocate, and I recognize that this is not within your purview as administrator, but I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about the process that the United States is currently going through to have a bid process to sell almost $3 billion of arms to the Duterte regime.
It is outside of my jurisdiction. I'm actually very interested in participating in interagency policy debates of that nature, but that is something we have to follow up on. Again, we're just wearing my hat as a member of the National Security Council, but I'm not sure. I don't have a response to that.
Even on a personal level, I understand it's not within your.
I might have, yes, I have lots of personal views, but I need to dig into that to understand exactly what that program is going to be used for, or what I've.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I would ask that you give it some thought and perhaps use your position and your background to influence what happens. I think it sends a bad message to a regime like Duterte's, as well as to the human rights activists and the journalists and dissidents and labor organizers and all of those who are under attack from the regime. So, but I understand and I respect your position. Let me direct this question, which I do believe is within your purview, having to do with the subject of child malnutrition around the world. This year, it's estimated that more than 3 million children around the globe will die as a result of malnutrition. And as the largest donor to the UN, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on how the fiscal year 22 budget will allow the US to assist UNICEF to develop and implement a global plan to rapidly scale up a high impact package of prevention and treatment interventions in the hardest hit countries. And also how the US will hold UNICEF accountable for implementing the plan.
Well, thank you for your leadership on this. You probably saw yesterday the news that Henrietta Fore, former USAID administrator, first female USAID administrator, unfortunately has to step down as executive director of UNICEF. I think they've done a tremendous job, advocating for this constituency, as have you. I think that the challenge, just in general, is that the the size of the emergency humanitarian response budget. And in our request, it's $10 billion, which would include funding for UNICEF as well as World Food Program and other actors who can reach people with severe food needs. But that is now being distributed across so many countries. So it's less about, are we choosing children over women, and more about what do we do about Lebanon and the Northern Triangle joining South Sudan, and Tigray now becoming a famine crisis, including the children of Tigray, alongside South Sudan and the traditional, food issues in the Sahel and northern Nigeria and so forth. So I think the hardest part about being responsive to the level of devastation that COVID has wrought is just how extensive those needs are. And I think what UNICEF has done really well is mobilize resources from the private sector, from private citizens. And what we do as USAID is I really want to scale up private sector contributions, because governments can't meet, even if all we cared about was food needs and not climate adaptation or post-conflict reconstruction. There's just not enough. There's not going to be, even if you met every dollar, in my wildest possible dream of a request, it's not going to be enough. And USAID needs to build out the infrastructure to bring more actors to the table, so it isn't just governments.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you so much for that. And I hope that you will use your vast background and experience to implement and help this administration carry forward the policy positions we so desperately need. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
No, I yield back. I now recognize, let's try Representative Tim Burchett again for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
We hear you now.
Great. I know that you'd be disappointed if I didn't get my question in, and I appreciate you, brother. You've been a good friend. Thank you, ma'am. Preventing and defeating pandemics is a global challenge, and demands that the United States obviously would take a leadership role because of our abilities at healthcare research and development limitations of some of these other countries. In that light, ma'am, what's the status of USA funding for the Coalition for Economic Preparedness Innovations, and what would be the planned contribution level? I'm sorry, ma'am, you cut out on me. Could you start over? I apologize.
No, my fault. So CEPI, thank you for the question. I think we partner with CEPI to try to accelerate the development of vaccines against zoonotic viruses, and infectious diseases. It's part of this global health security program that we have. We provided, I think in 2020, an initial $4 million with an intention to provide a total of $20 million over 5 years. And that's Lassa fever, MERS, Rift Valley fever, Ebola, et cetera. In 2022, we're including support for multilateral efforts and other partners. So it sort of gets to my response to the prior question. We're trying to bring others to the table here. And there may be a part, I'll have to get back to you on this, but the ARP, you all were very generous in seeking to meet this COVID moment, including through CEPI. And so I think we are finalizing those plans now about precisely what share of the ARP is going to go to CEPI in this period. Again, given all the other demands on the ARP money, given all the COVID fallout.
Well, would there be any way you could get me that in writing? It's not a gotcha thing. I'm genuinely concerned.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I sorry not to have the final number.
No, I get that. It's not, like I said, this is one of those deals. Somebody's going to put a mic in your face and ask you the exact amount, and you get busted for it because you get it, a little bit off. I'm not like that. I don't give a rip. You just get it back to me. That'd be cool.
We'll get it to you. Absolutely.
Thank you, ma'am. Like a lot of folks, I was pretty distressed when the Biden administration decision to allow the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I'm wondering what's USAID doing to assist European and Eurasian countries in reducing their dependence on Russian energy sources, and if that's in your bailiwick, so to speak.
I'm sorry to do this twice.
No, you're good.
I view this like a game show. Like I have, for 500. What is, I need to know all the answers to this. you know, my emphasis in terms of our Eastern European programming has, I confess, been on the anti-corruption work that we have been doing. I believe it's the Department of Energy and state, the sub-actors within state who've been looking at Nord Stream and other alternatives. And so I don't think that our programming is terribly active in that regard. As I mentioned in a response to one of your colleagues, you know, we only restarted the programming in 2014. We do have a countering malign Russian influence program line of effort. And so again, I don't think it has an energy component, but it's through the prism of seeing Russia's encroachment in its near abroad in ways that are, you know, devastating in terms of, you know, democratic civic space and so forth. So that's been our emphasis, is how do you push back? How do you support civil society? How do we give technical assistance to reformers like those just elected again in Moldova, so that they're in a position to maintain the constituency and support on the street? But I believe the energy work and the alternatives lie elsewhere, but I will confirm that.
All right, that'd be cool. Thank you. One other thing, if I got time, the terrorist activity in the Sahel, S-A-H-E-L. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it concerns me. But how is USAID addressing issues such as economic opportunity and effective governance?
Well, the Sahel is not known for its effective governance, which has been one of the reasons that recruitment, particularly in the undergoverned areas, has picked up, I think, over the course of the last decade. We have programs, and again, can get you details, but in everything from water resource management to at-risk youth, you know, people who don't have vocational skills, who leave school at age 12 and then are just, you know, kind of waiting around as Al-Qaeda or, you know, depending on the area, you know, some jihadi shows up and tries to recruit. The Global Fragility Act, which you all shepherded to completion, is going to give us a chance to focus in on one or two particular countries in that region and try to scale our programming because it's spread pretty thin across sectors. That selection is forthcoming.
You know, my mama used to say, I'd hate to make my living off the suffering of others, and you're making your living off of doing something good for folks, I hope. So thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming back to me, brother. I appreciate you.
I now recognize Representative Colin Allred of Texas for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Ambassador Power. Thank you for being with us. I think that the President's selection of you showed how important he thinks U.S. aid is, and you know, I think this is, you know, now that we are 60 years since the formation of USAID, led by President Kennedy. At that time, recovering from the devastation of the Second World War and the success of the Marshall Plan, you know, President Kennedy saw that by using our own financial power, our own soft power, you know, we could advance America's domestic security and really the world's security. And I think this is a pretty applicable time for that. And so I'm glad to have you in the job. I'm glad to be speaking with you again, ma'am. And I want to begin with journalists around the world, because obviously your own background there, I'm very concerned about democratic backsliding. And I think a key component of that is attacks on journalists from around the world, from, you know, Mexico to Hungary and Poland to Hong Kong. You know, journalists are being targeted and killed and arrested or silenced, and journalists as well as human rights activists. And I'm wondering how USAID's programming can better support these journalists, human rights activists, and really anyone who's trying to tell the truth about what's happening as some of these repressive governments or other groups try and stifle dissent or stifle information from getting out.
It is the illiberal forces, if not their first port of call, to try to destroy independent media. It's near the top of the priority list. And so as part of this refresh of looking at our democracy assistance more broadly, you know, we USAID and DRL have been supporting independent media in different form for a long time, but I think the threats that these journalists are facing in light of the technological surveillance, requires us to think, okay, well, what are the technological tools, for example, that we can provide to make it easier for them to continue to do their work in an unmolested way? One of the tools of the oligarchs is increasingly to sue independent journalists, right, who expose corruption. It's like their business model. They can just bake it in. And so it may not be that it makes sense to come from the US government, but we're looking at, what would a big insurance fund look like, so these journalists knew that they could continue to do these exposés and know that they'd have that kind of backing. I mean, many of these independent media outlets are mom and pop enterprises. So that's part of the answer. I think the other part, though, is policy and diplomacy, and it's not to think that there's a programmatic answer. Always. I mean, we will continue to support these warriors, on the front lines, as democracies backslide, or as the China continues to and Russia exert malign influence. But some of this also is about leveraging other aspects of the U.S. relationship and putting pressure on governments to protect the space for independent journalists to do that work, and holding governments accountable ourselves bilaterally when they stop doing that, as we've seen in so many parts of the world. So I can get you, if there's a specific region you're interested in. I will say, last thing I'd say, sorry, Congressman, is I think the Democracy Summit that President Biden is going to be chairing will focus in significant measure on this particular pool of individuals and what more democracies can do to support them. And so it won't just be us, looking inward to see, again, what this moment demands, but trying to pull other democracies into resourcing the protections they need.
Yeah, well, I see that as, I'm sure we agree that as being a key component of combating misinformation as well. And I know the president's been focused on that, and I hope that y'all do include that in that summit. I think I have about a minute left, and I just wanted to ask you if you would. You've spoken in the past about the importance of U.S. leadership to stimulate, kind of burden sharing in terms of, what we do, we can get others to do. I wonder if you could elaborate on how this budget request would help you leverage other funding sources for U.S. priorities.
Thank you for the question. I mean, first, I think of this as a former diplomat, just in terms of even what we did back in the day on Ebola, right? The United States made its contributions to Liberia. Then we got France to take leadership in Guinea, the UK to do so in Sierra Leone. What President Biden just did on vaccines, going to the G7, saying, here, we're buying 500 million, and then leveraging that to get a commitment of 500 million out of other countries. I think those are a couple examples. The budget request would allow USAID to build out our private sector core. I'm just back from Central America, as I mentioned in my opening statement, and I watched how the USAID's $500,000 investment, how our plucky, feisty team on the ground got local private sector actors to triple that and made it a $1.5 million agricultural investment where we bore the risk in case the crops failed. Private sector got in and said, okay, this is kind of free for us. And in the end, the crops didn't fail and everybody benefited. Now we get to take that model on the road. We don't have a lot of infrastructure to make those kinds of deals happen. Mark Green and others have built it out steadily, but I think given the gap between the problems of the world and the resources that governments can provide, that capacity, additional capacity there is needed, and that is reflected to some extent in the 2022 request, which was completed before I was confirmed. And so we look to 2023 as well to continue to grow that ability.
Your time has expired.
Thank you.
Your time has expired.
Sorry.
I now recognize Representative August Pfluger of Texas for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meeks, thank you very much. Ambassador Power, thank you for your testimony today. I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to just kind of look at, again, to associate myself with another member's comments, that none of these are gotcha questions, but I'm very concerned on the work that you're doing. And when you pair it up with energy poverty and looking at different regions that do have a problem, maybe for the first time that they have access to electricity. If there are policies that are counter to that actually take those countries backwards, then I'm interested to know, what impact this is having with USAID's work in some of the impoverished nations. I mean, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or the Indian subcontinent or otherwise. Can you kind of speak to what you see when it comes to energy poverty and how that ties into the work that you're doing and what effect it has on the impact of the goals and the objectives of USAID?
Congressman, I think you might have something very specific in mind that I think is going over my head. So if you have something that we're doing that you're concerned about, I'm not sure. I can speak to energy poverty and some of our programs designed to be responsive, but I'm not sure what if that's what you're getting at.
Let's look at the case of Guyana in just one specific example. I'm worried about the ties to the PRC there and looking at where they get their energy from, and if there are policies that we have as a country. I'm looking at Biden's recent policies on being a little bit restrictive and maybe over-regulatory on the types of energy that countries can have when it comes to our assistance. What impact will those have on your ability to work there and make a difference in the case of Guyana? I mean, this is a multi-layered question. I'm very worried about energy poverty and the ability for them to actually, come out of the dark, literally come out of the dark for the first time, maybe in the history of their country.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know about our energy programming or our bilateral policy posture vis-a-vis Guyana. I just don't. And again, I can get that to you as late as you want later today. It's just that's not something in my 2 months that I've have a mastery of. What I know a lot more about is, for example, Power Africa, and the commitment to electrification, the recognition that energy poverty and traditional poverty go together, and there, we have as our ambition connecting 60 million homes and businesses to electricity by 2030. As you know, there's a lot of pressure on the Biden administration, I think, in both directions. I think, if I'm hearing, I'm not sure I'm still getting exactly, but I think for you're perhaps asking, are we shifting countries too quickly away from fossil fuels such that they then, or natural gas, such that they're, that's then saddling them with a need to get solar or wind or things that they're not ready for. At the same time, there's a lot of pressure to go much more quickly, I think, through this weaning process, given the speed with which the climate is changing. And so I think Power Africa seeks to straddle that. DFC, we all have ambition to go carbon neutral by particular dates, depending on the projects. And most of these countries have those ambitions. So part of what we're doing is helping them with the regulatory environment, with the private sector investments, and sitting down and figuring out what is the quickest date by which they can meet their net zero carbon goals. But these are not us foisting these goals on other countries. Everybody's experiencing the same extreme weather events, and with the exception of China, which continues to blatantly and brazenly build more coal plants as part of Belt and Road. Most countries really do want to be a part of the solution, just as we do.
Well, I think that's the point, and you said your point of, energy poverty and poverty go together is exactly right. And so if we are part of the problem and over-regulating and mandating something not actually feasible, then I think that it does embolden and empowers China, and it offers them a step up. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. This is a tough topic. We want to get to the bottom of it and help. And while we help, we don't want to burden countries with unnecessary regulations that don't actually achieve our. That, Chairman, thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Tom Malinowski of New Jersey, who's the Vice Chair of the full committee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, it is wonderful to see you in this job and in front of our committee, first of all. And I want to take you back to the conversation about vaccines. You spoke about the challenge and the necessity of getting people around the world, particularly in developing countries, vaccinated against COVID, with the Delta variant surging, with supplies still low. And to that end, of course, the Biden administration has pledged to purchase the 500 million doses of vaccine, which then leveraged an equivalent amount from some of our allies. And on the one hand, that's a very big number. It's a very generous commitment. On the other hand, and maybe just make this a yes/no question, the need is in the billions, is it not? I mean, just for the COVAX countries, it would be upwards of around 8 or 9 billion to vaccinate 60 to 70% of those populations. Is that about right?
Yes, I mean, the working estimates that I've seen are 11 billion globally, and that's not including boosters if we end up needing boosters.
Got it. And so at the current rate, even with the 500 million, we're still looking at a lot of poor countries not being able to significantly vaccinate their populations until 2023, even 2024, correct?
Correct. But I mean, again, that's a timeline that we have every interest in seeking to accelerate.
Exactly, and that's what I want to get at. And thinking about what our share of this is, and we're 25% roughly of the global economy. I presume we have a significantly greater share of the world's manufacturing capacity for the mRNA vaccines in particular. And so that 500 million, although again, it sounds like a lot, it sounds generous, is significantly less than 25% of what our fair share even would be of getting the vaccines just to those poor countries. To say nothing of the huge opportunity, right, of doing more than our share, right? Because I think we all share this sense that there is a strategic opportunity in the United States, even if we don't vaccinate the world single-handedly, in being the great power that saves the day. So I guess I'd want to ask you, and I know you would need Congress for this, but whether you would agree that it's in our national interest, not just to purchase vaccines, but to really invest in building manufacturing capacity, including in the United States, to be able to deliver a much more significant share of that 11 billion number. Would you agree? If Congress were to step up, that would be good.
Yes, you might recall, having served in the executive branch, that I can't get in front of my betters, or maybe you've forgotten.
I know.
But I think that is where President Biden, I mean, that is the essence of his stated objective to become the arsenal, to be the arsenal of vaccines, right? That is the goal. And I think that right now what we've combined, and I'll let you continue here in a second, but just is surplus supply, which is very significant in the sense that it allows us to provide supply bilaterally, bringing the price way down with Pfizer so that COVAX could get more vaccine for less money. And what you haven't mentioned, but what is implicit, I think, in the broader ambition that you're speaking to is looking at tools like the Development Finance Corporation to do deals in places like South Africa, hopefully one forthcoming at some point in Senegal. It's something that we've been looking to. Other countries like Rwanda have raised their hand and said, we want to be part of this. But right now, Africa is importing 99% of their vaccines for all diseases. But the investments that we make, and the private sector has an interest in making, in building out this vaccine manufacturing capacity to get closer to that 11 billion, that will serve us well on future viruses and pandemics if needed, but also on other diseases. So I think that this emphasis on manufacturing capacity alongside—
I stopped you because I just—
European companies can do. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah. And yes, I am getting at that, but also manufacturing in the United States. Just very quickly, Tunisia. We just delivered a bunch of vaccine to Indonesia, democracy in Asia. This is the one functioning democracy that came out of the Arab Spring. They're being devastated right now. We've pledged, we've made promises. I hope you guys can make this a priority in the coming days.
We'll have to do that and back. Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Representative Peter Meyer of Michigan. 5 minutes. You're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Twice over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Powers, for joining us here today. I'm reflecting on some of the recent news out of Afghanistan, and having spent time there as part of the humanitarian community, was very aware of much of the development work that was being done by USAID. I guess I wanted to start off by gauging your thoughts on how, I guess, reflecting on Afghanistan and on your deep experience working in our development efforts more broadly, what lessons can we learn about how to effectively integrate our development efforts alongside parallel initiatives like counter narcotics, specifically in Afghanistan, but also pertaining to South America? So development alongside counter narcotics missions, law enforcement missions, or our diplomatic and military efforts. What lessons have we learned in the past few decades that we can make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes that we've witnessed time and again?
Well, it sounds like you probably have a view on the answer there if you witnessed some of the programming up close and personal in Afghanistan. I mean, the American people have not only sponsored and paid for large-scale military deployments, but have funded investments in humanitarian development assistance that have produced tremendous dividends in terms of the number of female entrepreneurs, the number of universities that exist now that never did, the millions of girls who passed through Afghan schools. But fundamentally, it's the three-legged stool, right? Which well from Afghanistan: security, governance, and the economic, or development picture. And the vulnerability now of those women and girls comes from the fact that the Afghan security forces don't yet, notwithstanding all of the training, appear to have the wherewithal, at least to be able to withstand this spate of attacks, in recent weeks. And so again, it's the fighting season. The front lines shift a lot and have over time. The Taliban has had momentum in different parts of the country for some time. But it is, the core lesson is just that all three legs of the stool, those investments have to take hold, at a comparable rate, or the stool is wobbly. And I will say, maybe a second lesson, and I'd love to hear if you have a thought on your own question, but I'm just back from Central America, and I was very struck it's the governance, and I should say in Afghanistan, major governance challenges, lack of unity, so two of the three legs really, really struggling there. But in Guatemala, for example, it is often our ambassador who can make just a profound difference in creating those synergies, especially in missions that are nowhere near as big as what we were investing in Afghanistan. But in Guatemala, to have INL together with our drug enforcement folks, together with CDC dealing with COVID, together with Usaid, together with all the different Department of Energy or the US trade representatives, if the ambassador convenes all of that together and has our programs seeking those synergies, we're much more effective. It still doesn't help you if you have governance going in the wrong direction, in a more corrupt direction, as you do sadly in Central America. But at least in terms of US interests, you see us, moving away from the silos, I think, that have characterized development policy in certain sectors for too long.
Well, and thank you for that. And silos, but also kind of that gravitational pull of different prioritization, right? Because you have a counter narcotics mission in Afghanistan that would burn a poppy field, and then a military counterinsurgency effort that would pay the farmer to plant it back so he didn't join the Taliban, but then all that funds are going to support the Taliban. A development project that seeks to support the local people, but then funds get siphoned off. Just massive endemic corruption. And many times some of those who were the most corrupt were also intelligence sources who were helping on the one side, but in ways that undermine that ultimate effort. So I hope in this role, obviously you have a deep experience in this area, but that we work to have a more centralized and focused mission, rather than the way in which our Afghan conflict hasn't been 20 years of war, but a one-year war fought 20 times over, and how that ultimately, as we're seeing right now, lines us up in the same place that we began. And with that, my time has expired. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Christie Callahan of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just making sure that you can hear me okay.
We hear you fine.
Excellent. And thank you so much, Administrator Power. I have had the opportunity to meet you, but you wouldn't remember it. It was long before I even thought of running for Congress. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be within your virtual presence and hope at some point to introduce myself again in person. My background is pretty eclectic. I'm a veteran as well as an entrepreneur, but I also have been an educator. And so my questions to you are kind of along those lines, if that's okay. In your written testimony, you described how the pandemic threatens to wipe away decades of developmental progress, and it could take many years to recover from the health, economic, and educational impacts. More than 90% of our world's learners have been impacted by COVID-19 with school closures. And history has taught us that the longer that students are out of school, the less likely it will be that they will return. So I strongly believe that U.S. foreign assistance should address these longstanding inequities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, particularly regarding access to quality education. So I'm really, really proud that the House recently passed my bill, which is the Global Learning Loss Assessment Act, which directs USAID to evaluate the impact of COVID-19 on the agency's basic education programs. And I'm very hopeful that that will also be passed in the Senate and onto the President's desk for signature. So my question to you is, how important is it for us to understand how this pandemic has affected our children's learning? And how crucial is it that we have data to back up that understanding?
Well, Congressman, first of all, nice to meet you virtually, and your background sounds perfect for dealing with practical problems in the real world. So wonderful that you've sought public service. So I guess what I'd say is it's so important and so relevant that your bill shouldn't have to pass for us to do an assessment of the kind that you're describing. I mean, it seems it's a first order need. I mean, I think UNICEF has done some interesting work. We were just talking about silos. USAID, of course, we have our 80 missions. We have programs in those 80 missions, but that run out of those 80 missions, but then also programs in 20 additional countries. So just thinking through how we would systematize, a baseline look, whether we had done the data collection before against which we would measure, I'd want to look into all of that, but it is, I mean, it's, the base of the pyramid, right? If we can't get girls educated, that has ramifications on family planning and how many kids they have and, per capita GDP and all the rest. And so getting, and there is a big concern that of the, 36 million kids who just, dropped completely out of school. I think 1.6 billion were affected by the pandemic is the estimate, but 36 million, not out, not in school at all in this last year. And I think there's a concern that 24 million of them won't go back, most of them girls.
Yeah,
so,
and I'm kind of an engineer by background, and so I really look forward to having that kind of quantitative data and working with you on that. One of the other questions I have with my last couple of minutes of time is that you said that USAID is committed to making education systems more resilient and more equitable, including by leveraging partnerships like the Global Partnership of Education and Education Can't Wait. However, the President's budget just released proposed funding basic education at below FY2021 enacted levels. Could you comment specifically on how USAID can support global education and leverage these complementary partnerships? And can you speak to how our foreign assistance will help students and education systems recover from the pandemic and improve on the delivery of quality education, especially for girls and marginalized youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think first on the President's budget request, fair point. Just the challenge after a meteorite hits the planet, which is what COVID has done really to education, health, compounded then by, climate change and the greatest number of conflicts since the end of the Cold War, the greatest number of displacements since Hitler. I don't have to tell you, it's just how to pay for it all without coming and asking for a doubling of USAID's budget. And so, some of our core priorities, it's just hard to know, what do you give up, an increase in climate funding? What about democracy and governance, given the authoritarian inroads that are being made? Health systems, we know we have been shattered by this. So we're just trying to balance a lot. But I take your point. I think, working with the British as well, who've been real champions of the Global Partnership for Education, as have we. But a part of the way that they've used their G7, I think, is to bring in new stakeholders and to look to governments, but to look to who some of these supplemental actors who haven't seen themselves as relevant to this conversation.
And I know I'm sorry I've run out of time, but I'd like to submit my other questions for the record, which have to do with UNFPA amongst other things. And I very much look forward to working with you on that issue as well. And thank you so much, Administrator Power. I look forward to meeting you in person.
Thank you.
Back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Dina Kane of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Power, I certainly appreciate all your time today and your very straightforward and informative answers. It's been so rewarding for us and enlightening to have somebody like you in this position. You talked about some of the minorities, LGBT, racial minorities, women, both inside USAID and in the work that you do. I'd like to mention and ask you about another group, and that's those with disabilities. So often when the countries are hit hard, whether it's politically or by bad weather or whatever, this is a community that's kind of left behind, left devastated, not really appreciated in terms of what they might contribute or what kind of help they might need. And I wonder if you think USAID has the proper resources in place to address this community globally and to help with things like independent living, self-sufficiently, economic opportunity.
Apologies, sorry, Congresswoman, my mouse was acting up. My mouse is tired. So thank you all for your patience sticking with me here. This is an issue very close to my heart. I know it sounds like a lot of things are, but while I was President Obama's human rights advisor, I took one of the great privileges of my life was working with persons with disabilities to try to champion the Disabilities Convention so that Americans with disabilities who travel abroad could enjoy the same accommodations internationally that they do here at home. I failed miserably with Senator Dole in getting that done, but hope springs eternal. But I think you're raising this issue is so important. It's, we're 3 hours in, you're the first person, and I had a prior hearing earlier in the morning, you're the first person to raise the issue. And it speaks to, I think, something that we just need to change in the way that we think about development. My commitment to you is not only to pursue sustainable development through local actors and others, like I mentioned in my opening statement, but to pursue inclusive development. And so what we want to do is think through in all of our missions around the world, who are the people who are not the natural first comers, as our partners, or who are the beneficiaries that are the hardest to reach. And that's not only people often with physical disabilities, but also with mental disabilities, and making sure that our programs go that extra mile in the same way that, years ago we thought about women who were not always first in the queue, often elbowed out of the way. That's especially true here. So in terms of specific programs, I confess I need to get more steeped in the details, like on disability rights per se, and the partners that we support. We certainly work with the State Department's disability coordinator, our envoy, and with DRL, which does a lot of programming in this area. But I think if we mainstream it and think about all of our health programs, our education programs, if we are prioritizing this community that if gravity alone would sort of almost necessarily leave behind, I think that as well will be very important. And again, how I instantiate that with the leadership team, I have to think through, but it's inclusive development is the essence of what we're trying to get done here, which requires a shift.
Well, thank you for that. I look forward to working with you. I'm a member of the House Democracy Partnership, and when we used to travel to some of these countries and have some of the NGOs that worked with disability groups, they were just so pleased and delighted to just be invited to the table because they're so often overlooked, that it really does make a difference, and they certainly make a great contribution to deciding policy or where we put priorities.
Agree completely. And on trips when I was UN ambassador, I often had the chance again to single out those groups and meet with them, and made a point of doing so in Korea and on one trip to Haiti. And it makes the world of difference. Again, they need programmatic support as well, but to lift up their fates also with the governments, with the host governments, that kind of policy intervention can end up meaning a lot if there's a piece of legislation pending or something of that nature.
Well, thank you. Please call on me as a friend and ally in this. And by the way, you sounded like my students. My dog ate my homework, but my cat ate my mouse. So thanks. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Sarah Jacobs of California for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ambassador Power. It's great to see you. I'm so excited to have you in this position. I want to first say how encouraged I am by your commitment to more robustly funding local organizations and partners. We know they're the best place to develop effective and durable solutions for building peace and sustainable, inclusive development gains. And I look forward to working with you to help lower the barriers to entry for these smaller organizations. And I also want to thank you and the administration for requesting full funding for the implementation of the Global Fragility Act. A couple of weeks ago, I led a letter with my colleagues and the chairman and ranking member to the Biden administration, including your office, requesting an update on the selection of countries, and I look forward to that response. I wanted to ask you about atrocity prevention, something I know you know more about than most, and how incredibly critical it is. The administration recently released its Elie Wiesel report to Congress, which I welcome. However, I noticed the countries mentioned are those already experiencing atrocities rather than the ones that require preventative work. And while it's important to focus on the countries that we know are currently experiencing atrocities and genocide, I think it's critical we don't forget that upstream preventative work. So I have a couple of questions for you. I'll throw them all at you. And then I have one on another topic at the end if we have time. But, basically, according to USAID's assessments, where do you see some of the most important opportunities for early upstream prevention? And what are you doing to bring about a reduction in the level of atrocity risk? Do you feel that the USAID offices focused on atrocity prevention have adequate funding for their programming and staffing to implement that programming and oversee funds to our partners? How many staff does USAID have dedicated to atrocity prevention? And then when I worked at the State Department in CSO, I worked closely with the Atrocity Prevention Board, which I know you were instrumental in getting set up and is now the Early Warning Atrocity Task Force. And I just wanted to know what we can learn from the task force and lessons learned, both the successes like in Burundi, but also some of the shortcomings as we look to do atrocity prevention moving forward.
Well, this deep into the hearing to meet the committee's atrocity prevention experts, I should be very grateful and am. So let me first talk about the inward focus at USAID. I hope I'm going to remember everything that you asked. So the President's budget request that we put forward requests an increase by $489 million to our DRG funding generally. And that is where, as you clearly know, the atrocity prevention programs live. I want to, and so what the share of that is will come about through a negotiation with the State Department, and if in the event the President's budget request is granted. But that is a line of effort that naturally would be very important to me. I do want to complicate the question a little bit insofar as there is the staff who work on atrocity prevention. There are not many, fewer than a handful, I think, within the DRG program. But you know as well as I do that the sources of state failure that give rise to atrocity, this is programming that needs to live across the agency. The atrocity risk has gone up because of COVID, right? The atrocity risk has gone up because the planet is getting hotter and there are fewer resources. That's what, Darfur, Syria, some of the biggest atrocity crimes of our respective lifetimes occurred because of conflicts that derived, at least in some part, to shrinking resources and the kind of displacement and resentments that stem therefrom. So my point is simply that I think we bring this prism to, and the focus is a conflict prevention prism, of which there are certain areas in the world that we would see atrocities to be a manifestation of conflict, or the way conflict gets fought, like in Tigray. Do you want to ask your last question? Because I see the clock is ticking.
Sure, yeah. I know we've talked about Mozambique. I wanted to specifically ask what, and particularly CPS and OTI, are doing to support work to address underlying grievances, in addition to the U.S. sending forces to help train the Mozambique army.
Well, I think right now, OTI, we are all very focused on the initial thing you said in your preamble, which was about the Global Fragility Act, and a question around country selection, is whether a country like that would be a candidate, particularly now as it's trending in the wrong direction, but not so far gone as some countries. But our Africa funding just, is almost entirely earmarked. And so our flexibility, to move money on a dime when a new set of prevention circumstances or response circumstances arise is not quite. That's another form of flexibility that I'd love to work with you all on. But OTI does move the quickest, and I as I say to people at USAID all the time. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, but I liken OTI to the material that the black box is made of on the airplane. Where my son asked me one day, "Why isn't the whole airplane made of this material?" I want all of USAID to be able to move as quickly as OTI to meet a prevention moment of the kind that may exist in Mozambique.
Thank you for that. And the gentlelady's time has expired. And I now recognize Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, who is the chairman of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. Great to see you again. Thank you for coming in front of our committee. And before I ask a few questions, I wanted to echo the statement of my colleague from Pennsylvania, Representative Houlihan, urging the administration to do more on education and address the impacts of COVID-19, including raising our pledge for the Global Partnership for Education. But let me ask you a few questions about USAID and its reorganization and how you're moving forward. I know you started your tenure at the tail end of the last administration's reorganization of the agency, and you have your own ideas about how to proceed and how to structure the agency, which I know that we've had a chance to talk about. But can you elaborate on what you expect to continue and what you expect to change from the USAID transformation started by Administrator Green?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, first, one change is already kind of in motion that I have made, which is that USAID is now seeking to mirror the State Department structure and to have a deputy for policy and program, and then the traditional deputy COO. That may sound, like a little, top heavy, or adding a job. But the last administration had 2 associate administrators and a deputy. Bottom line is, I think, given the amount of internal work that needs to be done with regard to staffing, workforce, diversity, equity, and inclusion, partnering with local organizations, being more nimble, being the kind of agency that everybody can think of as the speedy tool in the toolbox to meet a need that wasn't anticipated in the prior budget cycle. To have someone dedicated with me and working those internal reform issues, I think is going to be invaluable. And of course, President Biden has elevated USAID to be a member of the NSC and the Principals Committee. So also having somebody dedicated to policy and program at the Deputies Committee and beyond is going to be key. And the 2 women nominated for these positions are first rate. And I'm hoping they're going to have their hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this month and be in place soon. I am the only Senate confirmed official at USAID, at this moment, at least for this administration. So that's one. Second, I think the areas that we would, want to think about is I think the reorg, largely has created efficiencies and synergies, and for all the growing pains that inevitably accompany such a reorg, and there is reorg fatigue and there is COVID fatigue, I think people really commend the effort that my predecessor Mark Green made in making that happen. Something you and I have talked about, the Democracy Development and Innovation Bureau has a lot of disparate parts within it. Things that are of great importance to this administration, like climate, ocean plastics, democracy funding, atrocity prevention, women's empowerment, economic growth. I mean, the whole essence of what we want to do in so many countries. So I want to look at that and just see that it's fitting together in the way that had been intended. But,
Sure.
Right now I'm really focused on what we do in the real world, as well as some of these other bigger reform issues that every bureau needs to benefit from.
Sure, and let me just interject there real quick, because there was one issue that I was disappointed with the last administration in, which is the decision to do away with the Global Development Lab, which pioneered and scaled up innovative development programs. So I wanted to ask you, what are you doing to ensure that there's a home for innovation at USAID, where new ideas can be piloted, tested, and scaled up? And what do you see as the role of a Chief Innovation Officer position at USAID in this effort?
I was a big fan of the Development Innovations Ventures program and the lab, and I've dug into it a little bit even since our phone call. I gather that the Innovations Venture program, and I don't know how these things are quantified, but has a social rate of return of $17 of social benefit for every dollar of US taxpayer money spent. And this is a Nobel Prize winning economist, Michael Kramer, whose work you may know, who has done that calculation. So I do think these seed efforts are really important. It's a little bit like at Google, whatever percentage of time people have where they can just dream big. And we have scaled a lot of these programs, as you well know. I think what the last administration was doing in part was seeking to ensure that innovation was living not just in a hub, but across agencies. And so part of what I want to think through when we have our leadership team in place, for example, our Assistant Administrator for Global Health, who was just named yesterday, if and when he's confirmed, to think through how do we inject that same spirit of innovation, grand challenge, and other into the substantive bureaus. Or we can look at reconstituting the lab, but I haven't delved into that just yet.
Thank you. Right back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Jim Costa of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Ambassador. It's been a long hearing, and you've been patient enough to endure with all of us here. I just wanted to add, with our colleague Dina Tice talking about the efforts with USAID and disabilities, the challenges that you and your agency face are so great, and your resources are obviously limited, but certainly my friend Tony Quillo and others would be happy to support your efforts in that vein, and you can add me to that list. I've been a big supporter of your efforts in the multiple roles you played, and thank you for your service to our country. I'd like to focus in a little bit different direction. I'm a third-generation farmer, and I've been on the House Ag Committee for 17 years now. As a matter of fact, I apologize. I'm voting right now with still 10 votes on the Natural Resources Committee, so I'm literally multitasking. But food is a national security issue, not only in the United States, and I tell that to all of our folks here. And this pandemic has certainly taught us that, but it's a security issue around the world. Recent reports indicate that more than 161 million people in need of emergency food services since 2022. I think the number's frankly much greater than that in light of climate change and the other factors. I mean, you think about it, 200 years ago, we had 1.7 billion people on the planet. 3 years ago, we cooked 7 billion. By the middle of this century, we're estimated to have 9 billion. And with climate change, how you provide food is going to be critical. These are my following questions quickly as I multitask. COVID-19 pandemic, it's critical that we continue to help rebuild some of the most vulnerable communities in the world, not only with relates to vaccines, but also food subsistence. Could you please elaborate on the importance of funding programs as Food for Peace to help avert food insecurity, which also translates into domestic challenges and issues as we see in other parts of the world that we've highlighted here today? And then secondly, can you also reassure me of all the good work Food for Peace will not stop doing in the non-emergency space, where you've worked to build resilience in the most vulnerable communities with natural disasters and conflicts, domestic conflicts, to provide for themselves and their families. And it's just not the assistance, but we've got to provide ability for people to produce their own food. And with climate change in some of these arid regions, that's a tough task.
Yeah, well, let me just start by embracing the premise. You know, I confess, just in terms of my own background, unlike you, this is the area that I've probably learned the most about in my 2.5 months in the job and in preparing for the job. You know, new exposures to some extent to different dimensions of this. But I'm very struck that agricultural-led growth is up to 3 times more effective in reducing poverty than growth in any other sector. And I saw this in my trip to Central America, modest investments of the kind I alluded to earlier in the hearing, $500,000 investment in a small, you know, farm area, you know, more than 1,000 farming beneficiaries, private sector comes in, private sector has, you know, stands to make a profit, Usaid can recede. Those farmers are using seeds that they never would have had access to but for our involvement, and are aided in their effort also to export their avocados and other goods to American markets. And it works so well. It's linear, you know, the investments and the return on the investment. And I think the only gating issue here, well, climate, of course, is presenting new challenges every day, but we have through our food security program partnerships with dozens of American universities where we try to bring cutting edge insight, you know, into new technologies and innovations into our Food for Peace and into our Feed the Future programs. We also have the Farmer to Farmer program, which you may know about, which I haven't met anybody who's actually come out of this program, but it's like the coolest program where 20,000 farmers in this country basically partner virtually now with COVID with farmers living overseas. It's benefited 136 million people in 116 countries. And again, COVID has just
Madam Ambassador,
yeah, please.
I don't want to interrupt.
No, go ahead, sir. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Let me make a suggestion, and the chair is very generous. I chair the subcommittee on livestock and foreign agriculture. Why don't we get together with your team and talk about some of the programs that you folks are involved on that maybe we could help out and work together?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. Keep up the good work.
The long-awaited last question from a gentleman who has been waiting for long. I've been watching him diligently. Representative Brad Snyder of Illinois.
He gets the prize because he was here at the very beginning.
Exactly.
I was, and I've been back and forth, but thank you for your patience. Chairman, first, thank you for having this hearing. And I'm not sure, is it Ambassador Power or Administrator Power? What title do we use?
There's only one answer, sir. When you're administrator of Usaid, there's only one answer. Yeah, no, yeah. I was conflicted. My kids are conflicted. They have a slight bias toward my prior title. It sounds fancy at school.
So, well, tell them no matter how old they get, mom's the right answer.
Exactly.
So, but thank you, and thank you for all your service and what you're doing here. As everyone knows on this committee, as you've touched on, well, you've used the three-legged stool metaphor a number of areas, but we talk about it in the area of defense, diplomacy, and development is critical to protecting and advancing U.S. interests around the world. And so it's important to understand that USAID's work goes well beyond our moral leadership. It plays an integral role in our national security. And I, for one, I'm sure I'm not the only, is just grateful that you are now a full member of the National Security Council. So we're grateful for that. I want to focus on climate change and the role it plays, because all the challenges we face, and you touched on this on your statement and on your prepared remarks. Everything that we care about, everything that we're trying to do, the work we're trying to accomplish is going to be affected by climate change. It already is being affected. It's going to be affected even further. I appreciate the Biden administration's planning in fiscal year 22, reflecting a two-pronged approach in the context of climate change. First, the $2.5 billion in funding towards international climate programs shows the administration is serious in helping communities combat the impact in transitioning to a green economy. Especially pleased to see the commitment towards the Green Climate Fund. Second, the administration's worked climate policy into its other priorities. For example, combating food insecurity, demonstrating how the climate crisis cuts across all corners of the world and every sector of our global economy. So my question, Administrator Power, is how has the administration and USAID studied the strain climate change is placing on our assistance, and how will we ensure our assistance matches the growing need, whether it's agriculture or housing, all the things, the programs that we're trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think just even from the standpoint of American welfare, it's worth just, it's known to you and people who track this, but just the fact that 85% of emissions come from outside of America's borders. Like, we're very focused, those of us who are dedicated to trying to curb emissions at home, on our share, but that just places a premium on how we engage other countries for them to fulfill their commitments under their NDCs and go further. And so that's part of what USAID does is, you know, as we look for this next layer of ambition, we were on the sidelines for the last 4 years, but every NDC needs to be looked at against the backdrop of, you know, the kinds of extreme weather events that and the rising temperatures that we're experiencing every day. So that's in having 80 missions, having programs in 100 countries, a significant share of those countries are net emitters. Another very, very significant share and a greater share are those countries that are affected in the ways that you've alluded to and I've alluded to by increased conflict, by water challenges, by droughts that have set back some of the agricultural gains that Representative Costa and I were just talking about, and financing for you know, the kind of research that we need for climate smart agriculture. This is going to end up being a huge part of what USAID contributes to the world, and what our taxpayers contribute as well to what American farmers go through. We've had circumstances where these research institutions, we don't have a lot of time, these research institutions that USAID partners with comes up with a climate resistant or heat resistant seed that is used in Kenya, and we pilot it, we scale it, and then lo and behold, it finds its way back here because we have this global laboratory where we're trying out the climate. Extreme temperatures may hit Africa first, but they may hit parts of this country far too soon. And so this, it has to be mainstream. It touches every aspect of USAID's work. There's not one program area that is not affected by climate change, and the way it is lived within the agency. And to the credit of the last administrator, the programs continue. They may not have been advertised as you know, climate change programs as such, but it hasn't been mainstreamed except in the food security space. And so the answer to your question is something that I really have to think through about how it permeates every dimension of our program, much like our COVID task force recognizes that COVID touches every aspect of our program. And we're structured for that. We're not yet structured for the moment we find ourselves in with climate's effects.
Well, I look forward to working with you on that, and any way we can be helpful. And I've lost the clock on my screen, so I'm not sure where we are, but I would, if time allows, want to touch on the Anita Lowey Middle East Partnership for Peace. It looks like I am at zero, so I will just say this. It is critically important, having just come back from a CODA led by our chairman to Israel, to the West Bank and to Qatar, seeing the important role that the United States plays in all of these areas, and in particular that USAID plays. We have to make sure that we continue to invest in people and build those bridges. And as the lead sponsor on the normalization legislation in Congress, if we are going to bring peace to the region, lift up the lives of those in the region and around the world, we need the work that you do is critically important. So I look forward to working with you on the Partnership for Peace, as well as other things, and in particular climate change. And with that, Chairman Meeks, I yield back unless there's other people who want to ask more questions.
No, you yield back expired time. So I thought that your comments were very good as we come to a close. And I just want to make sure that the record is clear that I thank Administrator Power tremendously for your testimony and for giving of your time and being very generous with your time and answering every question that this committee had to ask. You know, I've said it before, though America is now back at the table, our return to the world community does not come with a clean slate. So we must again prove that America leads with its values and that we don't act solely by our own self-interest, but also by our compassion and our generosity. And U.S. aid is probably our most effective vehicle through which the United States can lead and give a helping hand. So it helps to lessen suffering and conflicts and respond to global health problems and provide assistance where needed all around the world. So what do we get? I mean, there were some questions individuals asking in return for that generosity. What do we get? Well, it's clear. We get our national security. We get helping prevent the issues plaguing other countries from spilling across our borders. And I think that indeed is an investment worth making and one that exemplifies our capacity for good in the world. I have no doubt that this committee and myself will be cooperating closely with your office on the many areas addressed throughout this hearing. I can tell you that as we re-enter CODELs again, congressional delegations, one of the things that over my career that has been most learning for me is when we visit U.S. aid projects throughout. It's more understanding of issues that's on the ground and how we're helping make ourselves, as I said, ourselves safe, but a better planet also. So I look forward to continuing our dialogue with you and USAID as we prepare further actions on the work that's ahead of all of us. And I just can't thank you enough again for your being here. I thank Ranking Member McCall, who we talked about putting this hearing together, and of course, all of the members of this committee. And I now adjourn this hearing.